Record. Alrighty. Welcome, everyone. This will probably be another episode of the Natural Order show. I think we're on maybe 18 or something like that. I didn't look at the exact number. We're somewhere around there. I'm back with Paul. Welcome.
Something like that. Yeah. Hey, what's up?
We've been a little bit less regular since I had a baby, but this was a good topic that Paul's been cooking up for a little bit, and I've done a ton of thinking on it over the years. Um, Basically, the topic for today is talking about Christianity, the conception of Christianity, and what all is behind that. You know, who was behind it, how much of it is as described in the Bible or the commonly told. You know, to what extent is it a psyop? You know, what were the political intentions behind it? So we're going to try to dive into a lot of that stuff. I'll just leave it light for there, but we have some slides and some notes to go off of, so we'll walk through it. But cool. Yeah. So you want to say anything before I pull up the slides?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that we're going to be looking at is just some quotes from people a few thousand years ago, around the time of Christ, discussing the Jews of their day. There's a lot of debate today, as we get into sort of religious topics in the Jew-aware community because of the ties between Judaism and Christianity, both being Abrahamic religions. There's a lot of people debating whether or not Christianity was created by the Jews. We're definitely on the the side that it was. But you know, there are some kind of copes that the Christians tend to come up with in defense of their religion, like, saying that today's Jews are descended from the Khazarians and they're not even related to the people of the Old Testament, which, the same people who say that will also call Jews Christ killers, which, you kind of have to believe one or the other. Either today's Jews are descended from the same people from the Bible who lived there and killed Christ, or they're not. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that reminds
So,
me of like something that I just throw in real quick. Like I kind of, as I mentioned last time, something I've always said is like I think that Christianity is either a Jewish psyop to subvert Rome or a Roman psyop to subvert Jews, and it kind of did a little bit of both, but it kind of did more of the former. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see.
yeah.
Cool deal. Let's see. I think I got them pulled up here. Whoops, I got the wrong one. So let's go ahead and unhide that. All right. So, and assuming I'm on the right one, is the quotes by Romans 2,000 years ago? That's the first slide, right?
Yep.
Sweet.
So we've got from Seneca the Younger, the customs of that most criminal nation Israel have gained such strength that they have now been received in all lands. The conquered have given laws to the conquerors.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen that, in the modern era where Jews are supposedly the suppressed minority, and yet they're 20 times as likely to be billionaires. They're more likely to be in positions in government, even when they're not holding office directly, like Trump's got a bunch of Jewish advisors. Biden had a bunch of Jewish advisors. The Clintons had a bunch of Jewish advisors.
Yep.
Obama and Bush and all of them did. Um, so yeah, same thing 2,000 years ago happening in ancient Rome that's happening today.
Mm.
We've got Cassius Dio. The Jews were destroying both Greeks and Romans. They ate the flesh of their victims, made belts for themselves out of their entrails, and dabbed themselves with their blood. In all, 220,000 men perished in Cyrene and 240,000 in Cyprus. For this reason, no Jew may set foot in Cyprus today. So, we've all heard kind of the rumors with, the Jewish tunnels under the synagogue in New York and the like stained mattresses and all the sexual blackmail rings and
Yeah.
supposed the like rumors about ritual murder and things like that. So 2,000 years ago, people were accusing the Jews of the same kinds of things that the, totally crazy conspiracy theorists of today are accusing them now.
It really is wild how consistent. You almost want to say like good job on being consistent throughout history, but like the way in which you're consistent is horrid. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty horrible thing to be consistent about. So Marcus Tullius Cicero, who lived before Christ, said the Jews belong to a dark and repulsive force. One knows how numerous this clique is, how they stick together, and what power they exercise through their unions. They are a nation of rascals and deceivers. The same way people today notice that Jews, they tribe up really hard. They totally support their own, tons of nepotism, they basically are their own, tribal supremacists in favor of their own Jewish people. Well, they were the same way to the same extreme 2,000 years ago. And then finally, we have Tacitus. Whatever their origin, these rights are maintained by their antiquity. The other customs of the Jews are base and abominable and owe their persistence to their depravity. For the worst rascals among other peoples, renouncing their ancestral religions, always kept sending tribute and contributions to Jerusalem, thereby increasing the wealth of the Jews. Again, the Jews are extremely loyal toward one another and always ready to show compassion, but toward every other people they feel only hate and enmity. They sit apart at meals and they sleep apart, and although as a race they are prone to lust, they abstain from intercourse with foreign women. Yet among themselves nothing is unlawful. They adopted circumcision to distinguish themselves from other peoples by this difference. So, yeah, definitely expanded on kind of the Cicero quote of just how horrible they are, what rascals they are. The fact that they're super loyal to their own people, but hate everybody else. They were the same kind of people 2,000 years ago that most people in the far right are accusing them of being today.
Yep. And this kind of like sets the stage for really the topic too. Is just because some people are going to say, like you said, all these things like, well, these people are different than those people, and so many technicalities about like ethnicity and race and what actually is a Jew. But it's kind of like it's easy to tell. It's not hard to tell, and it's the same attributes. So yeah, that's wild. Very anti-Semitic of them, but
Yeah, very.
yeah, good stuff. Cool. I guess we'll go ahead and jump over the next slide here. So, next slide,
Yeah, so the next
Torah
slide,
quotes.
this one's looking at their own holy book. I'm gonna go ahead and just give kind of a TLDR on like the Abrahamic bloodline for people, who haven't had time to read Genesis and Exodus. Basically, it started with Abraham, who was told by God that as long as he, kept faithful to God, that he would create a line of people who would create many nations and become the kings of many nations. That's interesting that he said Abraham would become the king of his line would become the kings of many nations because the Jewish tribes did not have kings for like hundreds of years afterwards. And even when they did in like the books of Samuel, and the people are calling to Samuel and saying, "Ask God to give us a king." Samuel is like, "God doesn't even want to give you a king. You're not supposed to have kings over your people." So it's weird that you have that combination there of the Jews being told that they would father the kings of many nations, but also told that they don't need kings of their own nation. So it really makes you wonder, well, who are they going to be, the kings of? And as we move along through the Abrahamic storyline, Abraham has a child, I think, called Isaac, who then has two children, Jacob and Esau. Esau's a like strong, proud, noble warrior, a hunter, wants to like protect and provide for his people. And Jacob is a little bit lazier, a little bit more like cunning and, more of a trickster. So he ends up tricking his father into giving him the blessing that the father wanted to give to Esau. So you have this trickster figure who basically steals God's blessing for himself, rather than the blessing being passed down through the noble warrior. So if you have a race of people who are supposed to found many nations, or and become the kings of many nations, and there's this implication that they're not necessarily becoming the kings of their own nations, and here you have this trickster getting the blessing. You have this narrative where the trickster is getting the blessing where he's going to father the kings of many nations. Well, how's he going to become the king of many nations? Probably trickery. He then gets punished essentially for his trickery by being tricked into marrying two women at the same time, which it's funny they think that's a punishment, but he ends up having a bunch of kids, the most famous of which is Joseph. And Joseph is almost like the perfect prototypical Jew. So I'm going to go ahead and go through the story of Joseph going to Egypt, and you can see if you've heard any of this before. So uh, basically, Joseph's brothers supposedly turn on him and chase him out of his homeland, and he goes to a new country as a refugee, who's basically claiming he was hated and oppressed in his own homeland and needs safe haven in somebody else's country. He steadily moves up the social ladder, starting out as basically a slave laborer and then moving up and up and up, until eventually he's granted an audience with the ruler of Egypt, the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh tells him about a dream that he's had, and Joseph basically spins that story into a tale about boom and bust economics, telling him you're going to have this big economic boom, this big harvest for like 7 years, and then for 7 years after that, you're going to have a bust. You're going to have barren fields. You're going to have poverty and all kinds of problems. But if you prepare during the years of plenty, you'll be fine during the years of famine. And so by telling him that, he gets Pharaoh to give him quite a bit of control over the Egyptian economy and particularly the granaries so that he can store up grain to prepare for the famine. Little known historical fact is the origin of currency, of the use of like coins basically as a way to trade things, was in ancient Egypt at their granaries. People would drop off grain, they'd be given a coin that said how many, bushels of grain or whatever they had dropped off, and then they could come back and exchange it, or they could trade it to other people for other things who could then come back and take the grain out themselves because there were just too many people for them to try and keep track of everyone individually, so they just had to switch to coins. So basically, he took over what was essentially the world's first bank, the first issuer of currency. Um, After the crisis has come and gone. He's hailed as a hero, and he's allowed to invite his family in, despite the fact that they supposedly, backstabbed him and betrayed him. He invites them in like nothing ever happened, and invites them specifically to feed off the fat of the land. In other words, to live off the wealth of the Egyptian people. So you have this story of a Jewish refugee going to a country that's not his own, uh, you know, bending the ear of the ruler, being given control of the economy, managing his way through a crisis that he may or may not have created himself with all the control he had over the economy, and then inviting more of his people in order to feed off the people of that land.
Never heard of anything like that happening ever. Not 109 times at all. That's why I never even realized. I never realized how archetypical it was. Hmm.
Yeah, like as I was kind of waking up to the more spiritual side of the conflict at one point, just one of those happy synchronicities. Was at work, and one of my coworkers didn't like what was playing on the mainstream top 40 station, so we switched to the religious station because they were playing gospel music or something. And then after the gospel music was done, they went into like a sermon about Joseph in Egypt, and I was just listening to it. And of course, it's being told by a Christian pastor who thinks that Joseph is the good guy, but I'm listening to it and I'm just like, heard this story before. I've heard every single element of the story before. I've seen Jews do this exact same
Yeah, you're
thing
just
and take
like
over economies in this exact way. This is what they do.
every single time. Um,
Yes.
there was another quote that reminds me of the. You haven't read the third quote yet, I don't think, down there. But
Oh, the like specific quotes. No, we can read those in a minute, but go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say something I was already thinking about. But in the last slide, there is a verse. I'm assuming it is in the Bible and not the Torah. I can't remember, but it's something. It's something very similar to the third quote, like unto a stranger you may lend, but it's like actually talking about like subverting nations through lending. It's like I think it says something specifically about that. I'm pretty sure. I need to go find it, but
Yeah, actually, let me go ahead and read these quotes. You can try and look yours up while I'm doing that. So the first one, neither shall thy name any more be Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations I have made thee, and I will make thee exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. So that's that Abrahamic blessing saying, Abraham, you're going to father kings. And like I explained with, the book of Samuel, uh, the Jews were told that they were, Jews, Hebrews, Israelites, whatever you want to call them, they were told they didn't need kings of their own nations. But yet they're said that kings will come from their line. So obviously those kings have to be somewhere. Then you get to a couple verses from Deuteronomy where Moses is speaking to the chosen people that he's just taken out of Egypt. For the Lord thy God blesseth thee as he promised thee, and thou shalt lend unto many nations, but thou shalt not borrow, and thou shalt reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over thee. So it's saying, you know, as the Lord has promised you, if you lend money to other nations but do not borrow from them, you will rule over many nations, and they will not rule over you. It's literally connecting putting other nations into debt slavery with ruling over them. So that makes it pretty explicit that the Jews are in fact supposed to reign over other nations, and they're supposed to do it through debt slavery, just like Joseph did. Uh, you then have one more. Unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all that thou settest thine hand to in the land whither thou goest to possess it. So basically, you can loan to outsiders at interest, but not to your own people. So there's different rules for lending to outsiders than to themselves. And when these people have basically been commanded by God to take over nations through debt slavery, and they're being told lend to other people at interest and put them into debt, but don't inflict the same kind of thing on your own people, it's pretty clear this is, a racial supremacist religion based around taking over nations through debt slavery. And that's exactly what the Jews have done.
Yeah, I think that second quote is actually the one I was thinking of. I don't know why I missed it, but yeah, that's pretty much it. And one of the kind of studies that I did fairly recently was almost kind of like, how do you say, like admiring the things that they've done right, like figuring out how important money is and how to manipulate money, and figuring out how to manipulate religion and to come up with, it's just like, to an extent, it's like they did a good job figuring that stuff out. Of course, it was again, it was for vile ends and for themselves at the expense of everyone else. But they figured it out. It was
Yeah, it's one of those things that's like it's terrible, but it's also kind of impressive just how terrible the things that they're able to pull off are.
yeah,
Yeah. But I guess I'll wrap that up with a little commentary on, the story of Exodus, where after the Jews have moved in and they've been running the economy, well, everyone gets fed up with them and says, we've had enough of you. We want you out. And so what do? Well, they inflict plagues and natural disasters and all kinds of calamities on the land to try to keep the people under control. And eventually it still doesn't work. So they genocide them, take a bunch of their wealth and run away. They take so much of their wealth that it takes decades to haul it all to their new land, even though their new land is like a 2-week hike away.
it's
I
basically
mean,
COVID. It was the first
yeah,
instance of COVID, and then
yeah, you can literally like slap a "You are here" sticker in the middle of Exodus, and it's totally accurate
yep,
because that's what we're living through
and
as
yeah, all the
history
money we're
repeats. Yeah.
giving to Israel and stuff. Yeah, hmm. Wild,
Yep.
good stuff. All right, I guess we'll go. We should be ready for the next one. Let's see.
Yeah, so I guess before we get into the rest of this, I'll say a little bit more here. So in a way, this video is kind of a sequel to the videos that we did about like Back to the Future and the Golem myth and how, occult symbolism and predictive programming and all that sort of thing gets inserted into modern media. And when you look at modern media, you've kind of got three big like occult or mystical spiritual narratives that at least that I've noticed. You've got the Saturn one, which we talked about in Back to the Future and how it shows up a little bit in Lord of the Rings and a few other things. We talked quite a bit about the golem and how the artificial man overthrowing his maker and how that ties into the narratives about Jewish power and how that showed up in Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Terminator and Dragon Ball Z. Well, there's another uh, basically mythical allegory or archetype that constantly shows up, and that's the chosen one. The chosen one. So you have that in Star Wars with Anakin, who's this prophesied chosen one that comes from a desert world, and he's owned by a guy who's a Jewish stereotype. So you have a lot of this symbolism where he kind of parallels Jesus, and he comes from a miracle birth that the Force created him inside of his mother without a father. Um, you have this prophecy about his coming, and yet the prophecy doesn't quite work out the way everyone expects it to, in the same way that, like, many of the Jews thought that Jesus was going to come as this military conqueror and they were going to take over through the military, but instead he came as this religious leader who converted the masses, which kind of parallels what we saw in the Old Testament with Jacob and Esau, where it was supposed to be the big strong warrior who got the blessing, but instead it was the trickster who got the blessing, who tricked his way into it, and we got almost a trickster messiah rather than a warlord messiah. But you see that chosen one narrative in Dune, where you have the was it the Bene Gesserit or something like that, that are this like little cult that's prophesied that there's going to be a holy messiah coming, and he's going to take over this desert planet where the spice comes from and all the spiritual visions happen. You have it in The Matrix where Neo has to, he's the prophesied one, and he's going to, he's got to go to Zion and save Zion, and there's, all the Jewish symbolism around Zion. Um, so this is a pretty common theme that shows up in a lot of modern media, including some works that have predictive programming, like we've talked about. And this, you know, it's something where its use today is very obviously based on Jesus, but what we're going to be looking at today as we look through the story of Jesus, as I talk a little bit about the book Caesar's Messiah, and you talk a little bit about the book Creating Christ, and some of the the narratives that go on in in the Gospels, um, basically the same things that they're doing today with predictive programming and spiritual symbolism as a control scheme. They were doing that 2,000 years ago when they created Christianity. And so the authors of these books that we're pulling a lot of this out of, for the most part, I think they're like atheistic or agnostic. They don't really believe in much of anything. The two of us, of course, me and you, we're pretty spiritual in our own ways. Just kind of in a very alternative way to Christianity. So we're not looking at this from like the atheistic perspective of, oh, it had to have been fake because, there's all these narratives in it. We're looking at it almost more from they created this as a control scheme, and whether it's using psychology or spirituality or magic or, whatever you want to call it, one way or another, they're creating these narratives that are going to hit a specific audience in a certain way, affect them subconsciously, get them to behave in a certain way so that they can be controlled en masse. Um,
Yeah, I was gonna say
and
on that, like the thing that the thing that people like you and I share with the kind of the more common atheists is like we're both kind of at the base. We're using kind of science and a objective analysis to kind of understand the pieces, but obviously a lot of like typical atheists kind of fall short. They don't really understand the subtleties of psychology and kind of getting into like those more elusive occult layers and how that stuff really is kind of scientific in a way. It's just again like a lot more of a soft science and an elusive subject, and so they kind of just don't really explore how powerful psychology is and the just all the symbolism and that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's definitely an added dimension that we share. So it's good.
yeah, and you have some people like Jung who, did a great job talking about archetype and allegory and, how that affects people psychologically in like a more scientific way. I'm even at the point now where, I've seen enough in my own life since I started exploring spirituality that I believe there is something else out there. That said, we live in a world of conspiracy, and there is a phrase that's common among a lot of these like occult orders, as above, so below. What happens above in the spiritual realm affects things down here below. What happens here below in the material realm affects things above. Um, One of the aspects of that is how you worship, what you give your spiritual energy to. That affects things. Another aspect is we live in a very conspiratorial world. If there are conspiracies down here below, there are probably conspiracies above to control and direct our spiritual energy. You know, I've come to the conclusion that the spiritual energy that we all have is the most powerful force in the universe, but it's also one that's not very well understood by the vast majority of people. And there are people out there that want to keep it that way because they want to be the ones in power. And a lot of those people are Jews. And they've been doing this for thousands of years, trying to control people's spirituality in order to take control over them. So a lot of people will look at the Jews and they'll see the political aspects of their control, the economic aspects, the sort of media manipulation and mind control. To me, I believe that the root of their power over us is spiritual. And while I don't think that atheism is the best answer to that, it's definitely better than directly giving your spiritual power to Jews. Um, but then again, there are some Christians who are trying to, de-Jew their Christianity in one way or another, which, that's better than nothing. But I think we do need to have this conversation with the broader movement about the origins of Christianity and how it parallels Jewish power. Because you look at how they control politics, they control the Democrats and they control the Republicans. They don't just control one party or the other, they control both and pit them against each other. In economics, they control the capitalist central banks in the West and they control the communist central planners in the East. And, they pit them against each other. They don't just push Marxism and only Marxism. They don't just push capitalism and only capitalism. They want two alternatives to pit against each other and use that conflict to accomplish their goals. When you come to religion, Christianity, the Bible starts with the Jewish Torah, continues through Jewish histories, gets into the Judean, Judahite rabbi who got circumcised and practiced Passover. Um, and then Saul the Jewish shapeshifter. And then you look at Islam, the second biggest religion on earth, and it's another Abrahamic religion that's got a slightly different take on the Torah myths and the Jewish Messiah and an extra Semitic prophet, but it still comes from the same root. So they're basically doing the same thing in religion that they do in politics and economics.
Yep. Yep, I pretty much agree with all that. Very good points. A lot of directions that we could take it. I won't try to derail us too much, but yeah, just the thing that stands out to me is definitely just, of course, bringing attention to the themes, specifically how Christianity continues to echo like those Jewish themes and how that influences us today. Like we wouldn't be talking about this kind of stuff if it wasn't like impactful and critical, and obviously like the way that Christianity is affecting our nation plays into the whole thing. So yeah, and like you said too, especially among like the somewhat larger political unit that we are kind of operating within, like kind of like the alt right or like the new right sphere, or even just the right in
Mhm.
general. This is just obviously a huge point of contention. Is like so many of them still get sucked into Christianity, which is wild. But anyway, yeah, good stuff. Either way, clarifying Christianity from a objective perspective, as well as a kind of a mystical, or how do you say, like just a psychological perspective, is a good effort. So we're in the right place.
Mhm. All right. Yeah, you can go ahead and bring up the next slide now.
Parallels between the Torah and the Gospels. Alrighty.
Yep. All right. So in the Torah, you had the miraculous birth of Isaac by an old woman. Abraham and his wife were both like roughly 100 years old when they had their child. In the Gospels, you have the miraculous birth of Jesus by a virgin. In the Torah, you have uh, basically the Egyptians kill a bunch of Jewish babies to try to kill Moses, but he escapes. In the Gospels, you have King Herod murdering babies to try to kill Jesus, but Joseph flees with him to Egypt. Uh, in both the Torah and the Gospels, the Torah, you have the Jews fleeing Egypt to go to Judea. In the Gospels, after Jesus is taken to Egypt, he then later returns to Judea. You had Moses get lost in the wilderness for 40 years. Had Jesus get lost in the wilderness for 40 days. Moses was given the Ten Commandments on a mountaintop, and Jesus gave the Ten Beatitudes in his Sermon on the Mount on a mountaintop. The In the Torah, you have the Passover story where they sacrifice an unblemished lamb. Jesus, of course, acted out basically the Passover sacrifice of being that sacrificial lamb. The lamb was supposed to be brought in for 4 days before the sacrifice. Jesus entered Jerusalem for 4 days, 4 days before being crucified. A scapegoat was released to carry away sins for Passover, and Barabbas the sinner was released in the place of Jesus. You had Joseph getting trapped in a pit for 3 days, and Jesus getting trapped in hell for 3 days. So you have tons of parallels between these stories, and especially the Passover sacrifice narrative being acted out, and some of the parallels with Moses, like the being lost in the wilderness, and the Beatitudes and the Ten Commandments being given on the mountain. Those are all things that Christian scholars pretty widely recognize. There's been tons of discussion about that by Christian theologians. There's actually a particular type of like archetypal or allegorical symbolism called typology that the Jews employed, where they'd give you basically a bunch of different characters that all have very similar narrative themes and a similar archetypal role, all kind of repeating one after another. So there are a bunch of Old Testament prophets that had similar events that had, parallel happenings happen to them basically, that Jesus also borrows from. And so this is something that happened constantly in their religion where they would repeat these same themes over and over again as sort of a way to like reinforce them as part of nature of God acting itself out over and over and over again through the generations. This is something that, this is a recognized part of their religion. Tons of Christians recognize that this symbolism, this allegory, this typology is important to their religion. So as we get into the rest of this and some of the parallels that, between biblical figures and non-biblical figures, just keep in mind that some people will try to dismiss the argument that we're going to make, saying, oh, it's all conjecture, it's all, hypothetical, it's all just how you interpret it. Well, tons of Christians are interpreting the Bible the same way when it comes to the parallels between the Old and New Testament. So if we can show the same kind of parallels between, figures from the Bible and figures outside the Bible and give a pretty plausible narrative for why that would be, that's no more, interpretive or speculative than what Christians have been doing with their own religion for thousands of years.
Yeah, one thing that, or a couple things that this reminds me of. So, like, one what you're used to doing is kind of like a lot of people will take the stories in the Old Testament, like the flood and the creation myths and some of this stuff, and they'll kind of like parallel even Jesus, and they'll parallel that to earlier things like uh, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and like others to
Hmm.
kind of illustrate how it's fabricated, how it's being borrowed, how it's like recurring these same stories, And this is kind of doing sort of doing the same. This is saying, hey, the New Testament is kind of basically based on the Old Testament. It is pretty much a fabrication, and obviously it's kind of speaking to where that fabrication is inspired by, like obviously the very Jewish text that it's based in. So yeah, I didn't know about a lot of these, so this is yeah, very good. Repeating the themes, definitely a lot of evidence that, like, again, Jesus is very Jewish inspired and fabricated.
Yeah, well, and another parallel to today's Jews is today's Jews still use typology today. Modern example of that would be superheroes, where like Batman lost his parents, watched his parents get killed by a mugger. Spider-Man watched, he's also an orphan. He watched his uncle get killed by a criminal. You've got like dozens of other superheroes who lost their parents or watched a loved one, get murdered or assaulted or whatever. Um, and the loss of a loved one gives them kind of the just like personality disorder that makes them have to don the mask, but it also gives them that like lust for vengeance that makes them want to go out and beat up criminals. And so you have all these different stories of Flash and Superman and all these others that many of them are written by totally different authors at different comic book companies. But most of them are Jewish and most of them are following the same formula that they've been given to sort of put a story out there. So they're using typology in comic books today the same way that they were using typology in the Bible thousands of years ago.
Yep, just the importance of archetypes, the importance of stories, like especially when you see more repeats throughout history from different sources, it definitely indicates something. There's always more to it.
Mhm. All right. Yeah, I guess we can go on to the next slide now.
Alrighty, let's see here. All right, now we're comparing Caesar to Jesus.
Yep. So Julius Caesar and Jesus, in Latin, their initials were IC. In English, they're JC, so they had the same initials. Julius Caesar's military campaign started in Gaul, while Jesus' ministry began in Galilee, so similar named countries. Julius Caesar met with Nicodemus of Bithynia. That was, important figure to his development, and Jesus met with a Nicodemus of Bethany. So again, very similarly named people from a very similarly named place. Julius Caesar became the Lord and Savior of Rome, and Jesus became the Lord and Savior of humanity, supposedly, or at least of the Jews. Um, Julius Caesar saved Rome by crossing the Rubicon, and Jesus saved humanity by dying on the cross. So both got a cross or crossing as like kind of the big formative event of their lives. Julius Caesar was betrayed by his close friend Brutus, and Jesus was betrayed by his close friend Judas. So not only were they both betrayed by a close friend, but Judas sounds kind of like Jew Brutus if you were to, basically be making a play on words there. uh,
Yeah.
both of them, yeah, both of them were killed by a group of Romans. Uh, Caesar was killed on the Ides of March, which the Ides of March is the middle of March, and Jesus was killed in the middle of Nisan, which is the Hebrew month that begins spring. March is also the month that begins spring on the Julian calendar. So they were both killed in the middle of the month that begins spring. The cult of Julius Caesar was a big religious movement in Rome for a while after his death, and of course, Christianity didn't really become popular or spread anywhere until after Jesus' supposed death.
That's something I want to. I'm sure you may already have something about it in the later slides, but that's something that, as I was kind of diving back in, that obviously really stands out. It's just like the lack of coverage from like a historical perspective and other sources of that period of like basically his life and early thereafter, like the most critical period to verifying the events of his life as well as the formation of Christianity. There's just not much said about it, and then all of a sudden in 100, like around 100 AD, then people start mentioning some little pieces here and there about this cult that's starting. So, to what extent that's intentional or illustrates the larger points about it being fabricated is very interesting. So that'll be something to get into maybe later at some point.
Oh yeah.
And whether how much of it may have been intentionally burned, how it may tie into the Library of Alexandria, um, yeah, or how much of it may have just been kind of how do you say, like almost back propagated. Like another thing I was reminding myself of is, of course, like the whole calendar system about trying to like zero the year zero and what that means, and it's supposed to be Jesus' birth, and when that even came to be, like that was also back propagated. Like it wasn't until like 500 AD that
Mhm.
someone tried to go back and say, oh, here's what we think his birth, his birthday was. So there's more
And then
interesting
build a
stuff.
calendar from there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of something that seems to be like back propagated, so basically all of the historical accounts of Nero like persecuting the Christians or Christians being responsible for the fire in Rome under Nero's reign, every mention of Christians being involved with that comes from at least like 100 years or so after it happened. So, all the records of that fire at the time that it happened, and there were plenty of people who, were alive when it happened and, witnessed it and wrote about it. None of them mentioned any kind of cult called Christianity. A couple of them mentioned some Jews being involved, but nothing,
no,
nothing about
no
a
one,
Jesus cult, just about Jews being
yeah, no one
involved.
blinked an eye at that. They're like Jews are always involved. Like, you know
Yeah,
what this reminds me of. You know what back propagating and like, almost rewriting historical events reminds me of in the modern day, the
what's
Holocaust.
that? Oh, yeah, definitely.
I'd be like, once again, another modern example of them doing the same thing. Like, but that also tells you, like, here in the modern age with so much, like literally in the last 100 years, like you would think how difficult it would be to try to like really warp a narrative and try to, you would think you couldn't get away with that. There's so many sources and there's documentation, there's pictures, but we have seen how questionable that narrative is. And so if they can pull it off here in the last 100 years, imagine what you could get away with back then. Like, no one was even, half the people weren't even writing anything down. So, like, it's super easy to just be like, yeah, this is actually what happened. Actually, there was a dude with magical powers who did that, And people were like, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a lot harder.
Yeah.
It's magnitudes harder to disprove something than it is to build a case for it. Yeah.
Yeah, although technology is kind of a double-edged sword on that, because on the one hand, you have way better tools for verifying things. On the other hand, they have way better tools for putting propaganda out there.
Right.
And so you kind of have to ask yourself, how much time do people spend watching the propaganda and being told what to think versus how much time do they spend using it to actually research and figure things out for themselves? And unfortunately, like for a lot of people, they spend a lot more time on the propaganda than figuring things out.
Well, this is something I wanted to, I mentioned, I think last time we talked, just about, like with the content of this message that we're exploring, for example, about when you think about the people, all the people that are out there, most people are either like kind of totally swept up by propaganda and just almost like schizophrenia, basically. Like they're just flat earth or Christianity, and they're just like they're not even, their critical faculties and logical processing aren't even there anyway. So like this message is almost lost on them. Like you could walk up to someone and be like, hey, look at all this, like this, the Bible is like totally crazy, and like not even, there's so many holes in it, they're not even thinking about it. And then on the flip side, you've got a lot of people that are like logically processing, like some of the authors of the books that we're referencing. But obviously, like the message is almost, it's okay. Like, or how do you say? There's not, you don't even really need to give the message to them. They're already over it. They're like, I don't care. Like, it's like, I know what the Jews are up to. I know that Christianity is basically like fake. So you kind of like, there's no point there. But yeah, I guess like, and of course there's a lot of people that just don't care at all. But that's just another thing to remind, is just that so many people are just wrapped up in this world of just like, it's what, and again, another weird thing that this exists as much as it does in the 21st century with all the science and technology and validation we have of things like the age of the earth and all these kind of things. But people still are able to live in these like basically schizophrenia holes. And it's wild. So once again, if you can get away with it now, you could get away with it, tenfold back then.
Oh yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so let's go ahead and go on to the next slide.
Flavians, Vespasian, Titus, and Josephus.
Yep. So basically, at this point, we're going to get into some of the politics that were going on in the first century AD, around the time that Christianity got its start. Um, so you had like the Julian emperors, which was, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Claudius, Nero, a few other people. But things kind of fell apart under Nero. And at that time, there was a military leader named Vespasian who was not like noble born, but basically he was, a skilled commander. And so he had been assigned by Nero to subdue the Judean revolt in 67. In 69, after Nero's death, there was a civil war. There was a big struggle for power, and he went to fight in that. Uh, course of that year, I think it was called like the Year of the Four Emperors because there were like four different emperors at different times of the year. But by the end of the year, Vespasian had basically won the conflict and ended up being proclaimed emperor. And he was named emperor by the Egyptian prefect who was a Hellenized Jew named Tiberius Julius Alexander. So the person who made Vespasian the emperor and, deified him was a Hellenized Jew, meaning he was racially Jewish but not religiously Jewish or culturally Jewish. Vespasian then had a son named Titus, another son named Domitian. Both Titus and Domitian would eventually become emperor. But Titus was the eldest son of Vespasian, and he took over the Judean campaign in 69 when Vespasian left to fight the civil war. In 70 AD, he besieged Jerusalem and destroyed the Jewish temple. But even though he destroyed the temple and, the like Zealots and Sicarii and the other factions that were fighting against Rome basically hated him. All the factions that were, pro-Roman or at least willing to work with the Romans liked him, and he ended up having a Jewish mistress named Berenice. But he was also deified and became the emperor in 79. Josephus was not directly related to Vespasian or Titus, or Domitian, the Flavian emperors, but he was a Jew, and he was the son of a Jewish priest named Matthias, and he became the military governor of Galilee. When the civil war broke out, he fought for Judea against the Romans, but was captured in 67. During his captivity, he had a vision that Vespasian would become emperor, and so he acted as the advisor to Vespasian and Titus, eventually being freed and adopted into the family when his vision came true and Vespasian became emperor. Josephus wrote Wars of the Jews, which is basically he was the first historian to mention any characters from the Gospels. It was the history. Wars of the Jews was the history of like the Vespasian and Titus of their campaign to subdue Judea, and that resulted in the destruction of the temple. So he's the main historical record that we have on that, and also the first person to mention anyone at all from the Gospels. But even he doesn't really like directly verify the existence of like a Christian religion at the time. But he does mention a lot of things in the Wars of the Jews that have really weird and strange parallels to the Gospels, and so that's what we're going to be diving into. And most of the rest of this is going to be looking at the allegorical parallels between the military campaign of Vespasian and Titus to destroy the temple and the Gospels of Jesus. And a lot of that's taken from the book Caesar's Messiah by Joseph Atwill. We're not going to get into every single thing that he brings up, but we're going to get into a lot of the bigger ones and what they mean and why they have me convinced that this basically was a spell used to like subvert Rome and how Vespasian and Titus were basically used to be a part of that process.
Yeah, so like obviously like all the ingredients are there. Like you've got basically the Rome trying to subdue the Jews and a lot of conflict there. You've got this guy, this basically former high-ranking military Jew who becomes like almost a traitor or like an advisor on the Roman side, who obviously takes an interest in trying to, subvert kind of both or kind of like play both sides or kind of try to create a union or so yeah, definitely Josephus like stands out as a very, very. Oh, and also he's a writer too. Like, and he's like you said, he's one of the first people to actually mention some of the things in the Bible, like to be an actual external source to validate some of the things in the Bible. And I think I remember this was something I don't remember how much this was mentioned in creating Christ versus just my own separate research, but like some of his writing on I believe it was in maybe the either the Wars of the Jews or one of his other books but it basically kind of reads as almost like Jewish religion for non-Jews. It's basically trying to, I mean that's pretty much it. Like you're trying to reach these other audiences in the way that it's worded, and so that's obviously really unique. Um, Another thing I kind of want to mention, just to throw in there on that note, it just occurred to me before we jumped on today. I'm thinking the Romans, as they conquered different groups of people all over the world, they were used to running into different religions and mythological systems, and so they had already basically almost systematized the process of integrating other symbols or interfacing other symbols with their own. In most cases, it was pretty easy. You would encounter like Norse, more like not Norse or Germanic pagans, and then you'd be like, okay, you've got similar gods in us. Like it's just Zeus, Jupiter. You would start to make these equations, and it wouldn't be too hard. But obviously, like the Jews were a whole different animal, and as part of that, it's almost like I almost imagine it like you typically have Rome kind of going out there and like trying to almost like convert or interface with other people, but when they tried to interface with Jews, it's almost like they almost got corrupted by it. It almost kind of like bit them back and tried to like take them over, and that's kind of what Josephus seems like he may have been in the midst of, was like trying to get everyone else to become almost like a pseudo Jew or like a basically like a good goy. So anyway, so
Yeah.
just a few notes that I had there.
Yeah, I mean that's all definitely pretty insightful in terms of what was going on at the time and how Joseph has behaved. It's also interesting kind of the parallel between him and Joseph as this trickster figure who took over nations. They've got basically the same name, and here's a guy who, as we're going to look into, was likely involved in the creation of Christianity, who, originally wanted to fight for Jewish freedom, but once it became obvious that Rome was going to win militarily, he switched sides and then had a lot of involvement
Every
in
single time.
yeah, yeah, in the creation of this movement that ended up taking over Rome instead. And yeah, like the Romans did integrate a lot of different, local tribal religions, and basically said, as long as you pay tribute to the empire and you give your tribute to Rome, we'll let you have whatever religion you want. And then they came across the Jews, and the Jews were like, "No, you can't put any Roman statues in our temple. Like, we can't allow that." And that ended up causing, the conflict that led to the temple being destroyed. Um,
That's funny. That's
but
funny that you
yeah,
mentioned
like
that. Like, I wanted to say, like, on the note of idolatry, and again, what made Jewish religion a different animal. Like, that's another huge kind of like not huge, but a pretty significant, a big study that I did recently was just like really trying to understand what was unique about Jewish religion and mysticism, and that was a big one. It was like the emphasis on idolatry and avoiding it. Another thing to kind of throw into the mix was the we'll get into this later, but the blending of fiction and real history, because most other like myths out there was just like Zeus shut out the world, and it's kind of like okay, like that's clearly like supernatural or whatever, and so that's almost like a distinction, even if it's subconscious. But in the case of something like Jesus, it's like and pretty much a lot of the stuff in the Bible and the Old Testament, they're basically saying this stuff actually happened. Like Moses actually parted the waters. Like whoever, I think it was Moses or someone, actually turned a staff into a snake. Like Jesus actually came back from the dead and actually like performed miracles. And so it's like really trying to blur these lines. Just another side note about what makes them unique in addition to the idolatry. Crazy stuff.
sure. Well, it kind of depends on which sets of myths you're looking at, because you do have some more like realistic ones, or something like Beowulf, like which is the original story was pre-Christian. You have people doing things that are basically supernatural. You have, monsters that are basically supernatural. But yet it's still written in this way that's like
It's a
pseudo-realistic, and
story. Like I feel like it
yeah,
was
you can see it
yeah,
happening, but it's mythologized. Yeah.
it was understood.
But yeah,
Maybe I don't know. Maybe some of these cultures were like this actually
yeah,
happened, or maybe they didn't. It wasn't clear, but that just seems to be a distinction. I don't know.
but yeah, I can see how like a lot of the myths, especially about the gods and like there's kind of a separation between the myths about the gods where you were supposed to take it as something like more allegorical and spiritual versus the myths about the heroes where it was meant to be more, historical, but with some supernatural elements. So something like the Trojan War and the Iliad would be
Yeah,
something where they took it as like more or less historical, but there was still this sort of like, spiritual element to it. But definitely the Jewish religion leans a lot more heavily towards the side of trying to make it, historical spirituality rather than allegorical and, you know, higher realm spirituality.
Yeah, and like you just said too, like usually there's a distinction between the hero myth and like the God myth, and that was obviously something that like Jesus and Jewish religion in general really tried to blend. Was like these are people that are, especially Jesus, like these are people that are also gods, that are also kind of like heroes, but in a really untypical kind of way, and this ties back to what you're
Or they
saying.
have a direct connection to, their one true God or whatever. Yeah.
Right, and it ties back to what you're saying too. I think this is a really good theme that I'm glad you set the stage early for it. The story of it was Saul and his brother. Who was his brother again? I forgot. Is it
Oh, Esau and Jacob.
there you go. Esau, yeah, Esau and Jacob, and the emergence of like the trickster archetype, and how there's like baked into the very almost the very beginning is, hey, the trickster wins out, especially for the Jewish, like that's their whole thing. That's kind of setting the stage for their like parasitic like female group strategy, evolutionary group strategy, like subversion, like that's what they were about from the beginning. And so and stories like Jesus kind of is that as well. It's like here's someone who's not like a he's not a strong military leader. Like he's very like effeminate, like basically desert communist hippie. So anyway, yeah, just more reverberations of the same themes, and kind of tells you a lot about where this stuff all comes from and what its intentions are.
Mhm.
Yep. Chord. Alrighty, this will be session 2 of the Natural Order show. Back with Paul to continue our walkthrough basically on the origins of Christianity, kind of the story not told, more of the theories regarding its potential creation as almost like a psyop, so to speak, or a creation of either the Roman Empire and or the Jews of the time. So we in our first session we tackled a few different angles, and today we are picking back up with I believe the I've got the conquest of Galilee and the Zealots in Gadara.
So yeah, last time we pretty much just covered the fact that the Jews of 2,000 years ago were pretty much the same people as the Jews of today. That there's things in the Torah that are very similar to what Jews are doing today. We then talked a little bit about the parallels between Julius Caesar and Jesus, and a little bit about the Vespasian and Titus, the Flavian emperors of Rome,
Yep.
and how tied up they were in Jewish politics. And they were the ones that destroyed the Jewish temple, which of course was foretold in the Gospels. Most of the rest of what we're going to go over today is from this book called Caesar's Messiah. It's a theory, basically. The author of it, Joseph Atwill, kind of ascribes guilt to the Romans, to the Vespasian and Titus, and basically says that they and their family were the ones that spread the religion in order to pacify Judea. I agree with a lot of the pieces of their theory, but my ultimate theory is that they were really just pawns being used by Jews like Josephus Flavius, who were creating the religion to subvert Rome, but they needed to convince the people who ran Rome to let them spread their religion. And so to do that, they convinced them that they were going to be spreading a religion that would pacify Judea, but in reality, it was not created to pacify Judea; it was created to pacify Rome. But to do that, we're going to be continuing to look at the parallels, the allegories, the archetypes, that sort of thing, and the way that symbolism in it is used to communicate hidden messages, the same way that we looked at the hidden messages in, movies and mass media and such. So starting with this slide on the
Sorry,
conquest of,
I wanted to pause for a second before we jump into the slide, just to say like the way you framed that gave me a new kind of understanding, which is that almost at the end of the day, regardless of how exactly it was created and what the original intention was and who exactly was involved and how many layers of like 5D chess there may have been, it could have been like Rome or Jewish or blah blah. Like at the end of the day, it's almost like a new technology or a new weapon was created. A weapon of psychological subversion was kind of created, and just like any other weapon, obviously that can be yielded for different means. And so that's like one of the underlying or really overarching points that we can continue to make is just like obviously Christianity is a pacifying force, but it is interesting to see what the original intent may have been. So anyway, I just want to throw that in there. So
yeah, and definitely this kind of psyop of, convincing people to worship something. It didn't even necessarily begin with Christianity. There are some theories that there was a guy in Egypt, I forget his name off the top of my head, one of the pharaohs of Egypt. Oh, Akhenaten, I think is the one,
Mhm.
who basically like tried to impose monotheism on Egypt, but the people basically drove him out. And so that there are some theories that he may have been like an early attempt at imposing, a monotheistic cult as a control scheme, the same way that Christianity turned it out to be.
Yeah.
So Christianity may not have been the first attempt, but it was,
Well,
the most successful. It did become the biggest religion on earth.
that's actually interesting that you say that because totally forgot about this. But in some of my previous research into these matters, I do remember reading something about, I believe, a Roman emperor who was kind of trying to move move in that same direction as well. He was kind of trying to create like a more unified, like singular, monotheistic, solar cult that also kind of helped him to like maybe like deify his own his self. You know, just basically like worship me, worship like the emperor over everything else. And I remember maybe Sol Invictus or something like that. And I want to say it may have coincided around the same time. So it also makes you wonder if it's one of those things where like history was moving in this direction regardless, like maybe reaching that stage, and so the recipe was just there. So interesting.
Yeah, well, and there were quite a few different, religions and cults and mystery schools and such that all had like pieces of them kind of taken and inserted into Christianity.
Yeah.
I believe the Church of Sol Invictus was one of those, as well as like the Mithraic mystery cults and such.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there was definitely, you know, some experimenting with religion going on at the time, and some of it was people doing, legitimate spiritual experimentation, and other people were trying to create psychological control schemes to sort of control the masses. So, uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. You got to think that throughout history, even way earlier than Christianity, that like the priest would have would have known that religion has this impact on people. Like even if they believe the gods were real and were, I'm sure to an extent they did. Like regardless, they probably would have understood how religion functioned in a society, and also like as scribes and priests, like they can obviously really they saw themselves as like the translator of the wills of the gods, so they knew about manipulating. Like this thing wasn't new, so yeah, there definitely was
yeah,
some
because
intent.
yeah, 'cause even as somebody who like I'm not an atheist, I'm firmly convinced that spiritual energy exists, that there is, a reality to spirituality out there, but at the same time, it is something where it takes a lot of effort to actually get to the point where you're accessing real spirituality. So the vast majority of the masses, where they're basically their spiritual experience is praying, and sometimes their prayers are answered and sometimes they're not.
All right.
They don't really have the tools to figure out whether or not the priest is telling them the truth or not, or whether or not the priest that they're sort of like directing their spiritual energy towards in worship is, using that for what they say they are, or using it for a good goal.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, like the psychological control scheme aspect of it does end up being more important to the masses overall, even if, for some of us who are like exploring spirituality and doing meditation and things like that, that may not be the most interesting thing for our own personal development, but it is the most interesting thing in terms of how society is controlled, and how the masses are basically kept in this like spiritual control scheme prison.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's almost like two different discussions about like what it means to kind of tap into these forces that are beyond our current scientific understanding and what all is there to that, and from like a personal standpoint. And then it's kind of like just a whole other thing when you're analyzing culture, or like how the masses operate and how these religious systems start to emerge and how that affects behavior. And yeah, so it's wild.
Yeah, because as we're talking about Christianity, we end up finding ourselves on the side of the atheists in terms of trying to debunk it. But when it comes to spirituality, then we end up on the other side of saying, well, no, spirituality is real. It's just
Yeah.
this form of it is fake.
Yeah, it's really just like a lot of political discussions. Like you're out there like, talking shit about like liberals, and then they're like, "Oh, well, you're just a Trump supporter." And it's like, "No, that's a whole other problem. I just happen to think that your problem is a bigger problem." And it's the same thing with
Yeah.
religion. I'm on Facebook like talking shit about Christianity, and they're just like Cope, like Reddit atheist neckbeard, and I'm like, like
Yeah, and
like it's
I
just
don't
such a
even necessarily think Christianity is the worst religion out there. I'd rather live among Christians than Muslims, but it's
yeah,
still, it's still a spiritual control scheme created by Jews one way or another. And so
yeah.
it's kind of like Democrat versus Republican or communist versus
It's,
capitalist,
yeah,
where they
yep,
control both sides.
absolutely. And it
Yeah,
literally is the
you can
same.
prefer one side, but
It's
yeah.
like not just it. It's not just a metaphor for that dynamic. It literally is the same uh, culprits behind both pyramids or
Yeah.
schemes of control. So, yep.
Yep.
Yep, yep, yep.
All right. Well, I guess with that, are you ready to jump into the slides then?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Yeah. So this first slide, conquest of Galilee and the Zealots in Gadara. So you had the Roman military campaign of Titus and Vespasian that began in Galilee against the Jews in Gennesareth, who were led by a man named Jesus. And in the Gospels, Jesus' ministry began in Galilee at Gennesaret. So they spell it differently, but it's the same place. Um, the first major battle of the campaign to to pacify the Jews and destroy their temple. The first major battle by the Sea of Galilee, they basically drove the Jewish troops back into the sea, and so the Jewish troops were like swimming through the sea to get away from the Romans. So the Romans got onto boats, went out into the Sea of Galilee, and started attacking people with spears and arrows and darts, and basically, fishing for men in the lake, just like Jesus went to that same lake to gather his disciples and promised to make them fishers of men. Uh,
Interesting.
in the in the war, the Sicarii and the Zealots in Gadara were training and fighting forces the size are training to become fighting forces the size of legions, led by a man named John, who's described as having the actions of many reduced into his one head in the Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Jesus, after gathering the disciples at Galilee, the next place he went to was Gadara, where he found a man possessed by demons who called themselves Legion because there were many voices in one head. So again, you have a similar description of the demoniac named John who had thousands of voices in his head, and the man named John who was leading a group of zealots into forming legion-sized fighting forces. Was described with similar words in the Wars of the Jews to how the John who had many demons in him was described in the Bible.
Yeah.
Uh,
Hmm.
in that battle, the Roman troops drove the Jewish rebels off of a cliff into a river, causing them to drown, and Jesus drove the demons out into a large herd of pigs who ran off the cliff and drowned. There were about 2,000 men who were drowned or killed in that battle versus about 2,000 pigs who were drowned or killed in the story of the demon-possessed man in the gospel. You have a lot of parallels between the Fishers of Men story and the demoniac at Gadara story versus the first two major battles of Wars of the Jews that happened in the same places. They have, one of them involved, the battle involved a character named Jesus as the leader, whose men got fished for versus the Jesus who gathered fishers of men. And then you had a John who was leading, the legion-sized fighting forces versus a man named John who had demons in his head that called themselves Legion. You had both groups driven off a cliff and drowned in about the same numbers. And it's kind of, if you look at this as, the Gospels being kind of a dark parody of the campaign to destroy the temple, uh, the dark comedy, you see it in the Fishers of Men, where he's telling them, "Oh, you'll become fishers of men at the same place where men were fished for." You have, the Jewish rebels basically being referred to as pigs. Well, why is that dark and comedic? Well, because Jews don't eat pigs, which is another really weird part about the story of the demoniac at Gadara, because this takes place in Israel, where most people were following the laws of Moses, which say you're not allowed to eat pigs because they're unclean.
Hmm.
So why was somebody herding 2,000 pigs in Israel where almost nobody eats pigs? If you take that story at face value, it's like, it doesn't make sense because there should not have been a herd of thousands of pigs in Israel where almost nobody eats pork.
I feel like that's the same reaction to the Bible in its totality. Like you just read that and go, that does not make sense. Yeah, it does start to unravel from
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, so like that story taken at face value makes absolutely no sense, but that story taken as a parody of what happened in the Wars of the Jews makes perfect sense. You've got a guy with the same name who, basically is calling himself, this demon-possessed man with a legion of demons in his head, when in reality it was a guy with the same name, John, who was leading legion-sized fighting forces, and they're calling the Jewish rebels pigs and comparing the people who got killed to a herd of pigs.
Hmm.
So it makes a lot more sense as a dark comedy than it does as a legitimate literal story about somebody herding thousands of pigs in a land where nobody eats pork.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think like trying to think of what all to make of that. Like on one hand, it just reminds me of like almost any like literary what's the right word like homage that there is out there, like like the Odyssey and then Ulysses and stuff, or kind of just retellings of the
Mhm.
same story, borrowed myths and stuff. But and so on one hand, I feel like it could just be that it's just like they were just looking for source material, but obviously there is a layer that there could be more intention there. Like they definitely were trying to draw specific parallels between Roman, almost like the way that holidays were repurposed, like in the way that like pagan holidays were repurposed into Christian ones. It's kind of almost the same thing. Like maybe maybe I'm just trying to think like maybe people in Rome were like already kind of aware of these like. Well, that's one thing I was going to ask. So like all these things on the left from this Roman conquest. What do we know? What the timeline was of the dating of those events approximately?
They would have been at the start of the war. So I think that would have been in probably 67 or 68.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, yeah. Okay. So they had definitely had some time to kind of like simmer, and I don't know what that whole thing would have been like in a population like whatever a conquest happens and stories are told, maybe and shared around. Maybe people were already talking about that, and then people just started to go, "Oh, that's Jesus you're talking about." I don't know. It's just interesting to think about how that transition may have come about, but yeah, definitely seems like there's some intention, and regardless, there's some parallels.
Yep. All right. Ready for the next one?
Yep. All
All right.
right.
So in Caesar's Messiah, he gives a list of like a few dozen different examples and sayings, speeches and such that basically happen in order in the Wars of the Jews by Josephus Flavius and in the Gospels, where there's basically all these similar parallel events. I'm not going to go through the whole list of a few dozen things because that would just be too much to go through. But I did pick out a handful of the bigger and clearer ones where there's really obvious parallel between the two, and especially in well-known parts of the Bible. So in Wars of the Jews, you've got the 12th Legion who were robbed by Jewish bandits on the road through Samaria. I just found them and resupplied them so you could find them again. Same point that happens in Wars of the Jews. In the Gospels, you have the story of the Good Samaritan, where a Jew on the road through Samaria is attacked by Jewish bandits, robbed but saved by a Good Samaritan. So in both stories, you have Jewish bandits robbing somebody on the road to Samaria and then getting helped by somebody who's not Jewish. Um, you have the speeches by a guy named the Woe Saying Jesus in the Wars of the Jews, who's a guy named Jesus who arrives in Jerusalem for Passover, starts saying, "Woe to Jerusalem, and woe to the priests, and woe to the temple, and woe to the Jews, and woe upon everything." And so that passage is called the Woe Saying Jesus. But he's seized and taken to the Roman procurator, who orders him beaten, and then he dies during the siege on Jerusalem. Jesus delivered very similar lines at that same point in the Gospels, saying, "Woe to Jerusalem, woe to its people, woe to the priests and such." And he ended up being seized and brought before the Romans, who order his crucifixion, where he's beaten on the way and dies on the cross. So you have these you have a guy named Jesus who's delivering all these woe-saying lines at the same point in Wars of the Jews as the Jesus in the Gospels is just delivering all these woe-saying lines to the people of Jerusalem. Very similar text in both cases. There's even been like quite a few scholars who noticed the parallels between these two. They just didn't necessarily put it together in terms of the whole overarching narrative. But
Right.
like the similarity between those two figures has been noticed by a lot of people, and some people even suggested that Josephus was like mocking Christianity by putting that character into his history. Uh, so one way or another, those two stories do seem to be connected. There's a whole lot of people who believe that they are, regardless of whether or not they accept the rest of Joseph Atwell's thesis.
So okay,
Um,
question. So
yeah.
or from this line and the last, all these events that occurred like are these all from Flavius Josephus' book or his writings on the wars of the Jews? Is that correct?
Yes, they are. Yeah,
Wow.
they're all from his history of the war to pacify Judea that resulted in the temple being destroyed.
So whenever you said like 67, I guess you were saying whenever we said around like 67 AD, would that have been when these events actually happened, or would that have been whenever he was writing about them?
He was writing about them later during the 70s. So the war started in 67 AD.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, then there was a civil war in 69. So Vespasian left and Titus took over the campaign in 69. And then in 70 AD is when the temple was actually destroyed.
Wow. That's this is crazy. Like this is so much solidifying the case of like his involvement in the origins. Like yeah, because okay, because obviously he was a Jewish general, and I wonder. I guess I'm trying to think. So let me think for a second. So
Yeah, because Josephus was basically on both sides of the war. He started on the Jewish side and then got captured and became an advisor to the Roman side.
okay, that's what I
So
was
he
going to
saw it
ask.
from
Like
both
so
sides.
he
Yeah.
kind of converted like during the war. So all the things he's
Hmm.
writing about are just his knowledge of the events on either side potentially.
Right.
Okay. Yep. Wow.
Yep.
Yep. Sounds good.
Okay, so the next point, there's a rebel leader named Elisar, who we're going to get into more later. Elisar and Lazarus are basically the same name, just in like written in different languages. So the rebel leader Elisar, who got captured on the Mount of Olives, and it was on the Mount of Olives where Jesus was betrayed by Judas and arrested by the Romans. So you have, a Jewish leader being arrested on the Mount of Olives in both at the same point in the story. And then after that, Josephus finds three of his friends who have been crucified, begged Titus to show them mercy. They were taken down. Two of them still died, but one of them survived and recovered. Jesus, of course, was crucified as part of a group of three men. The other two men died, but Jesus resurrected and, recovered basically. So, and that, again, in Wars of the Jews, it
Oh my
happens
god.
after the
That's
destruction of the temple. So
crazy.
it's like one of the last few things in there is Josephus finding three of his friends who'd been crucified, had them taken down. One of them survived and
That's
recovered
like
at the same
fucking
time
mind-boggling.
as Jesus
Like
coming back. Yeah.
I did not even know that the evidence was like this clear. Like this dude clearly is like the author of Christianity. Like that's fucking crazy, or at least like the prominent. Like he may have been among others, but like holy moly, that fits so perfectly. And what's crazy too is it's not even speculative. It's like literally here's his one thing that he wrote, and then Christianity is right here. Like I guess in theory someone could have based Christianity off of his work and not him. That's possible, but either way, the groundwork is there. Like, and he is a very good candidate just based on his background. He definitely laid the groundwork. Yeah, wow.
Yeah, so basically either he created Christianity or whoever created Christianity was like doing it while working with him or basing it off of his work and or making a tribute to his work in some way because there's just so many parallels there.
Yep.
Uh, The only other alternative would be that he was writing the Wars of the Jews specifically as a mockery of Christianity, and that's why he put the parallels into it.
Well,
But it's kind
okay,
of
that yeah, you did mention that, so that is an interesting. That's an interesting possible.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
then you're also talking about a historical text that was, making an attempt to at least be like, am I accurate historically? So like, would his historical text have survived for as long as it did and been as respected as it was if he was just like rewriting events in order to fit, this obscure religion that had not really taken hold yet,
Yeah. And obviously, like
coming out.
it definitely, yeah, that's a much more challenging theory to construct that would have been that way because obviously the events of wars on the Jews are very much based on like actual conquest, whereas like obviously Christianity is basically like framed like a storybook tale about like fantasy miracles and all this kind of stuff, and obviously he experienced this stuff on the left. I feel like it'd be much harder to like to reverse it basically to for that to be true. I mean, yeah, it's conceivable, but much less likely.
Yeah, definitely much more likely that Christianity was based off of his work than the other way around. I agree. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff.
All right. So the next slide is another weird parallel from Josephus's work. Just a little It's a little story from Wars of the Jews that's about a woman named Mary who was in Jerusalem at the time of the siege, which one of the things that's weird about this story is because it's about a woman living in Jerusalem at the time of the siege while Josephus was with the Roman army outside the city. There's no way that Josephus could have witnessed these events.
Hmm.
The only way he could have written about this woman is basically if he was had like heard the tale secondhand and then wrote it down because he would not have been there to have witnessed this event himself.
Hmm.
Um, but there's a really weird parallel between this particular story of Mary, the mother of Jesus from Wars of the Jews, and Mary and Jesus from the Gospels. You got that slide pulled up?
Yep.
Okay. So Mary is the daughter of a man named Eleazar or Lazarus and descended from the house of Hyssop. Hyssop is a plant that was used in Exodus to mark the doors with lamb's blood, so it's a reference to Passover. She was stuck in Jerusalem during the siege on the city with her baby Jesus. The Jewish guards confiscated her food to feed themselves and left her to starve. With no food to feed herself, she struggled to feed her baby and went crazy with hunger. One of the specific lines she said is, "Come on, be thou my food, and be thou a fury to these seditious varlets, and a myth to the world, which is all that is now wanting to complete the calamities of us Jews." So notice that line, a myth to the world. So she's
Mm.
calling her baby Jesus a myth to the world. Those
Wow.
words, she then killed and cooked her own baby and ate half of him.
God.
Guards, yeah. The guards then smelled the meat and came to confiscate whatever food she had. And she said, "This is mine own son. Come eat of this food, for I have eaten of it myself."
Which is obviously like
And
the communion, Jesus saying like, "Eat from my flesh" or whatever.
yep, and that happens right about the same point in Wars of the Jews as the Last Supper does in the Gospels. So you have a woman named Mary with a baby named Jesus who calls her baby a myth to the world and offers his flesh up as food to be eaten in the same way that Jesus in the Passover supper offers his flesh up as, offers the bread as like metaphorical flesh
Yeah.
to be eaten.
Wow. Once again, I cannot believe like how much evidence there is and how I've not heard of this yet. That's crazy.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to go read Wars of the Jews just to like see it for myself. Holy moly.
yeah, and this story from there. It's another one where people have noticed the weird similarities, the weird parallels, but people have previously assumed that this was Josephus mocking Christianity, uh, rather than this, being an intentionally constructed parallel. But they thought that he was mocking an existing Christian religion, whereas what he was really doing was creating the religion at the same time and putting the evidence that the religion was created in a parody into his other work, but hiding it well enough that most people wouldn't notice, which is kind of the goal whenever you're creating one of those, you know, like psychological spiritual control schemes, just like with Back to the Future. 99% of people who watch that movie have no idea that it's about 9/11. Well, you don't want people to just read Wars of the Jews and the Gospels and just automatically be able to conclude, oh yeah, these were written by the same people for the same purpose to, hide messages. You want those messages to be hidden well enough that 99% of people will miss them, but they have to be clear enough that that tiny handful of people who are going to notice them will have the ability to notice them. And this is one of those that, it's clear enough that once you see it, you're like, okay, yeah, I can see that. I'm noticing now. And they have to put that kind of thing in there, with the way their spirituality works. They believe that they have to tell you what they're doing, but they don't have to tell you in a way that's all that clear. So this is one of those things where they're putting it in there just clearly enough that they can say, yes, I told you, but not clearly enough that 99% of people 99% of people still won't notice it, basically.
Yeah. One thing I'm thinking is like, um, well, a Wars of the Jews is like dated and actually written like to that time, like the 70s or so. And obviously,
Hmm.
like I don't know like the oldest actual paper recordings of the gospel are, but I believe they're like later, like at least after 100. So that's kind of one piece of evidence alone. It's like as far as when it was actually written down. And the other thing I'm thinking too is like, you know, and this is kind of a piece of evidence that kind of maybe suggests that he was not the one that wrote the gospel, because I do wonder like how what did this writing get dispersed like back then. Like I don't imagine he was like right, obviously like there was no printing press, so this was all
Right.
handwritten stuff. I don't imagine it was like, he's obviously not like publicly distributing this kind of stuff. This is almost just like his journal. He's almost just kind of almost like writing this for himself and like maybe a small audience of people who can maybe make copies of it. Um,
Well, there were professional scribes who would copy things by hand back then. And like in the Jewish temple, you had plenty of copies of the Torah and the other religious texts.
right.
And, in Roman society, you had, libraries and scholars and, people who would sit around copying books as their job all day. So it's not like you had no copies of this floating around. But yeah, it was definitely one of those things where like the masses would never actually own a copy of any of these works. The masses would be lucky to have somebody read pieces of these works to them from their
Well,
copy.
well, that's kind of what I.
But there was like an educated elite who could get a hold of, copied works and pay somebody to make copies of them.
Well, here's what I'm thinking about that because, like, as far as the argument of like whether this is like satire, whether Wars of the Jews is like satire or history, I'm thinking like in this time period, like, do we know like, I guess there was like, there's been Greek theater tragedies, comedies, so I guess satire was a thing. But
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know. I felt like the time period would have suggested that satire wouldn't really be a thing because you wouldn't really be distributing this to like an audience and like really expecting any kind of like money from it. Really, you just had more historians of this time that were literally just like writing things down like just to keep a record. Um, and then you have like religious
Um,
texts, so maybe I don't know.
yeah, I would disagree on satire not being a thing because you got to figure this was kind of the heyday of the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
So it was, things were about as advanced as they were going to get in terms of like the elite being able to get a hold of books, in terms of there being libraries around, in terms of there being scribes who could copy things,
We'll
in terms of there
see.
being theater and performances
Right.
and things like that.
Okay.
So you might not have like the masses going to a satire show and necessarily getting it, but at least among the elite, you had plenty of people who were, well read and,
Yeah.
had hundreds of books and whatever, and went to plays regularly and things like that. So you would at least have satire among the elite. And
Yeah.
so this may have been something where like he wrote it with the expectation that like the rich and powerful people who could afford to, buy a copy of Wars of the Jews would read that, and then when they hear about Christianity, they'd be like, "Oh, that's that thing that Josephus was making fun of." Whereas the masses who would not have access to, historical texts like that, who wouldn't be able to buy books and whatever, uh, they would be hearing about Christianity and not have access to the satire and not have any idea that this is something that the elite were making fun of.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I'm thinking of two caveats though. One is like if we're saying like this is the heyday of the Roman Empire that like literature was like well distributed and stuff, but yet this time period from like whatever around approximate dating of like 0 to 100, the most critical time for uncovering what happened here, it's like there's nothing there. Like it's such a ghost town, like you have Tacitus or Tacitus around. There's a few writers floating around, but it just seems like a real like ghost town, and maybe that could have been because of burnings and things that happened after the fact. So that's one thing. The other thing is like again back to, so like because what the piece of evidence I offered was kind of saying this is not a satire. The county you're suggesting says, well, that's not necessarily, it could, the satire was around, but one thing I'm thinking is like, just taking it at face value. Obviously, we're reading slides and not the thing itself. This might be another reason for me to
Mm.
go check out the source document to kind of like see how it reads, and because I feel like if it's a satire, even if it's back then, you can kind of tell. Like, and yeah, and obviously, so I don't know what it actually reads like, but I feel like I would probably be able to tell if I read it, like if they're trying to be joke satirical or not. So I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah, some of that, like, it may be hard to get it from a translation just because some of the people who are translating it are trying to take it at literal face value rather than
Yeah,
as
that's a
something
good
with
point.
satire.
That's a yeah.
Yeah,
Comedy does not translate well. Yeah,
yeah, especially not when the person that's translating it doesn't expect it to be a comedy.
but
So,
I guess like you're
yeah.
saying that and this is so a couple things. So like, I'm wondering like you're saying a lot of the people who know about this because I was like, how does no one talk about this? And you're saying a lot of the people in like the academic community think probably subscribe to that this is a satire. So I'd be interested to research that more. And the other thing I was thinking too, you just kind of alluded to, which is that like if you are Josephus and you wrote Wars of the Jews, and like I said, this is kind of evidence that he didn't turn around and write Christianity, because he would have known that he already wrote this, and especially if he distributed this and it's already out there, like there's no way he could have been like, okay, I just wrote this thing, and now I'm going to go write this thing and say that this, and it, like I can't see that happening. So that definitely muddies that theory up. But so a lot of interesting
Well, so
possibility.
yeah, somewhat you have to keep in mind there is if they were written for different audiences, it's not necessarily expecting everyone who reads one to read the other. So it might be like, okay, the elite members of the Flavian family, and and that part of the nobility, they're going to read both of them, and they're going to see the parallels. Whereas the masses, they're just going to get the Gospels.
I
They're
see.
not going to get the historical text.
I can't imagine anyone really doing that and thinking it's gonna fly. Like, and maybe that's just naive of me, but like, you got to think there's gonna be some overlap, and then that's gonna really hurt the credibility. Especially like, it's one thing if this is like two different works of fiction that are just out there, maybe people aren't gonna pay that much attention. But if you're wanting to base a religion off of one of them, and like either Josephus or whoever wrote the Gospels, if Wars of the Jews was already out there and they knew it, like surely they wouldn't think like, I'm gonna get away with this. Like someone's gonna see this, and it's just like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and that's where the different audiences come in, where like among the elite, it was almost an inside joke of look at how funny this religion that we made is and how easily it's controlling the masses. Whereas for the masses, they're only getting the one and not the other. And yeah, there may be a little overlap here and there, but the vast majority of people are not like going to the library and reading books back then. It was, the elite, the well-educated, the rich, they were going to the library and reading books, but the masses were not really.
Yeah. Interesting.
So
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
yeah,
I'll
so
think
it's
more about
it's
it.
plausible, but yeah. All right. So next slide on names. Simon, John, Lazarus, Elisar, and Mary. There are certain names that were used repeatedly for multiple characters, both in Wars of the Jews and the Gospels. And keep in mind that, in Judea and Israel, there were like hundreds of different names. There are hundreds of different names that show up in the Old Testament, but there were a handful of names that were repeated over and over again. We had Simon. There were 13 Simons in Wars of the Jews and 9 in the New Testament. There were 8 Johns in Wars of the Jews and 2 in the New Testament. There were 9 Eleazars and 2 Lazarus 9 Eleazars in Wars of the Jews and 2 Lazaruses in the New Testament. There was 1 Mary and 4 Mary Anns, so variant of Mary in Wars of the Jews, and 7 Marys in the New Testament. There were 6 Jesuses in Wars of the Jews, and at least 3 of them in the New Testament. There was 5 Matthias or Matthews in Wars of the Jews and 2 in the New Testament. There were 7 Josephs in Wars of the Jews and 2 in the New Testament. And there were 10 Judases in Wars of the Jews and 4 in the New Testament. So
Hmm.
there were repeats of all of those names in each of those works. And there were a lot of names that were common in that area back then that did not show up much in either work. The
Hmm.
reason for that is each of those names was a common name among the Maccabeans, the Maccabees, the Jewish family or clan that led the resistance against Greek rule. They were the ones in the Hanukkah story. The book of Maccabees is about Hanukkah. They
Hmm.
also ruled up until the Roman conquest, and so they were among the leaders of the Jewish revolt against the Romans because they were basically trying to put themselves back in power. Eleazar was a Jewish priest from the Maccabee line who began the Jewish rebellion against Rome that Vespasian was sent to put an end to, and that ended with Titus destroying the Temple of Jerusalem. Eleazar was also the one that was captured on the Mount of Olives. So the guy who started the Jewish rebellion is the guy who was captured in the same place that Jesus was captured.
I'm gonna
Simon and John.
let me throw something there real
Oh, go
quick.
ahead.
So, if I
Yeah.
remember correctly, wasn't there a New Testament a book in the New Testament called Maccabees that was like removed from the canon? Wasn't that one of the one? I'm pretty sure, or maybe it's the Old Testament. Either way, I'm pretty sure that there was a book in the Bible called Maccabees that was one of the ones that was
There,
removed.
there is it's an Old Testament book. I think it's still in at least some versions of the Bible. It might depend on, which
Right.
which translation or
Well,
whatever you
I think
have.
it's like the Ethiopian one is like the one where you can see a lot of the ones that have been removed are still there. Like, I had a conversation. This is a whole separate thing. I had a conversation the other day about some of those, like the Apocrypha, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gospel of Thomas, the Book of Enoch, like a lot of these like crazy ones that just like reveal so much more. So that's a whole other conversation
Mhm.
we can get into sometime about those books that were removed and how all that went. But anyway,
Yeah, the Book of Enoch's one of the more interesting ones that
oh god, yeah,
I do want to read up on.
yeah, yeah. Of the all the ones we were talking about, that was the one. Like, oh man, yeah. My friend, my friend Neil. I've kind of been wanting to do. I kind of want to have him on here, or maybe do a talk because we got talking about it. It's a lot of the same stuff that like Alex Jones talks about. Where like and what's his name too? There's one guy who's like an occultist. He's like a black guy who's like a occult dude who talks about like the Anunnaki and aliens and how like draws parallels or like interprets the Bible as if it's like aliens and or these interdimensional entities, and it's just next level stuff. It's fucking crazy.
It does sound interesting. Yeah, we should do a show with him sometime
Yeah,
talking about.
let's do it.
I'm
Any
not like a firm believer in the like Anunnaki and and parallel dimension beings and stuff like that
yeah, we
thing,
should.
but it is interesting to theorize about
Yeah,
at
man.
least.
That's right up our alley.
Yeah.
We're talking about religion and occult and all the possible, and there's a lot of stuff to it. So for me, I told him I was like, years ago, like I was getting really deep in all this stuff, and I kind of just like, I don't know, I kind of just like I felt like I was getting too deep, and I had to just like kind of reconnect with society because I was just like, no one. I literally don't know anybody that I could talk about this stuff with. Like, it would just be like people would think I'm crazy. So I kind of just like tucked it away. But like I've built so much infrastructure and so many in a network since then to like really maybe dive back. And we also just like talked about like the possibility of using these narratives to kind of like because I talk all the time about like what can we do with Christianity? Can we throw it away? Can we salvage it? Can we move it in a new direction? And like I think that some of this stuff might be ripe for trying to unify and give it a direction for because it is actually somewhat based in reality with things that we know about like DMT entities and the possibility of aliens and it kind of like is like an actual telling that's not like it's supremely magical and it but it's like yeah but it's believable it's evidential um, anyway, so that's a
Yeah,
whole thing we could get
and
into.
yeah, and at least the Christians who read the Apocrypha are like more open-minded than the Christians who are just like biblical literalists.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's
at
the
least
thing though.
that portion of Christianity, like I can at least have those fun like conspiracy arguments about, okay, well, what were the Nephilim really?
Well,
You know?
this is one of the interesting things about it is because, like you said, typically we run into issues with like Christian fundamentalists or biblical literalists, and but then we say, oh, this what we're talking about is based off of stuff that was actually in the original Bible, and so that would really be a
Mhm.
brain fuck, for and so I think that really, I could definitely see this like opening a can of worms and helping to get more. Because I see a lot of things spinning within the Christian movement, and it kind of like a lot of it like kind of parallels with like politics and Trump and QAnon, and it's just like some people even get into like flat Earth level. So there's just like a mosh pit of like schizophrenia, and a lot of us just hope that we could just get rid of all the schizophrenia and just start thinking clearly. But we kind of realize that just like probably Josephus, if he wrote this satirically back in the day, that like there's a distinction between the elites and the masses, and what you feed the masses is ultimately going to be important. So I don't know.
Mhm.
Anyway, cool stuff. We'll talk more about it.
All right. So, getting back into the slide. So, Simon and John were two of the bigger leaders of the Jewish rebellion during the siege on Jerusalem. And the Simon and John who led the Jewish rebels during the siege share the same fate as Jesus' disciples, Simon and John, in the New Testament. I think it's Simon, I believe it's Simon gets put to death, and John ends up like being taken prisoner at the end and sent to like do a bunch of writing in order to do penance for his crimes,
Interesting.
which is a little bit weird of a fate for, the leader of a rebel movement to end up, being taken prisoner and then writing things, but then again it's basically the same fate as Josephus. Um, so yeah, so basically, those two characters had the same fate in the New Testament as they did in Wars of the Jews. And then the name Mary means rebellious woman in Hebrew, and Magdalene means from Magdal, which is a town in Galilee. So Mary Magdalene means rebel woman from Magdal. So the reason that Mary Magdalene shows up so much in the Gospels is it can literally just reference any woman who was part of the rebel movement who was from the town of Magdal.
Hmm.
And then the Sicarii were one of the factions of rebels alongside the Zealots. And Judas Iscariot's name, Iscariot or Sicari, like basically the same
Hmm.
word written slightly differently. So Judas is actually named after the Sicari movement that was one of the factions of rebels.
Wild. Hmm.
And there were one interesting fact is there was quite a bit of infighting between the Sicari and the other like factions of rebels during the war. That's part of the reason that they lost so handily was that they spent almost as much time fighting each other as they did fighting the Romans. So part of Judas being the traitor may be because the Sicari also backstabbed their own Jewish allies multiple times.
Right, and this could have been like an instance of like another instance of basically like how Christianity was inspired by the wars of the Jews and like the reality of it, or it could have been that just like the characters in the Bible were just actually from these places and actually had those attributes or those names for that same reason. So, yep,
Yeah, but then you have to wonder, like, why did basically every character in the Gospels have a name, that's in common with the Maccabee family rather than the hundreds of other names that were much more common at the time?
yep,
So,
yeah, that's
yeah,
definitely the kind of the overarching uh, pattern evidence.
yep. All right. So the next slide, and this one, this is kind of the one that clinches for me that the Gospels were like an artificial creation that were all made by the same person or the same group of people at least, rather than being, random separate stories that were created by separate people who witnessed the same events. Basically, if you take the four stories of Jesus' empty tomb in the Gospels and you put them up next to each other and you take them literally, uh, they're all different. They all involve different numbers of people showing up at the tomb at a different time, seeing different things there. And if you take them all at face value, then none of them, like, you kind of have to pick which one's true and which other three are false, or, you can't take this as being literal word of God because it's four separate stories saying different things happened and different
That's
people
wild.
saw different things.
Like that's literally
So yeah,
canon. Yeah, like it's so weird
yeah,
that that's considered to be the case. But I guess people just maybe like people like write it off. Well, first of all, most once again, like most Christians aren't actually like even thinking about it, like and trying to like make sense of it. But maybe if anyone does, they think like, oh well, there was what actually happened in the original stories of it, and kind of game of telephone in different ways. People wrote it down, and then the actual writings were collected later. So, but once again, if that's yet another cognitive dissonance, if that's the case, then why is biblical infallibility even a thing? Like, anyway,
right. Because how can you have an infallible Bible that's like the one true
literally
word of God,
contradicts
and yet you've
itself.
got it contradicting itself here? Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, score one for anybody who's not a biblical literalist against them. But if you're somebody who takes the Bible as just people, passing down their version of what they saw, um, okay, you can then at that point make an excuse for four different eyewitness accounts. But what's weird is when you actually line them up and read them as like a parody. Uh, Joseph Atwell kind of describes it as a comedy of errors. You kind of read through it as if it's this artificial construct that's made to be a joke by the people who are writing it, and the butt of the joke is the people believing it. If you read it like that, it actually does make perfect sense.
Okay.
I'm going to go through here. So, uh, in the Gospel of John, it starts with Lazarus, before Jesus' crucifixion and everything. Lazarus's tomb was empty because Lazarus was raised from the dead. The stone was rolled away, and the two of them were buried in basically the same place, like same set of caves. So the two tombs were very close to each other, and one of them had its stone rolled away and was empty. And that happened less than a week before the crucifixion. So in the Gospel of John, Mary comes to the tomb before sunrise. So it's still dark out, still night, sun's not starting to come up. She doesn't see anyone else there. There are no angels. She finds the empty tomb. In John, she leaves the tomb and tells Simon Peter and another disciple that Jesus is risen. The disciple, like basically Simon Peter and the other disciple, race to the tomb, and the disciple arrives there first, looks into the tomb, but stays outside. In the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you can tell which order they happen in based on like when the story begins. So Matthew starts first of the other three, and that one starts at the start of sunrise, and they use like a different term for like the very beginning of sunrise versus just during sunrise in Mark. and versus early morning in Luke. So in Matthew, the one that comes first, Mary comes at the start of sunrise and sees one angel outside the tomb, just like at the start of sunrise in John, the one disciple is standing outside the tomb, but looked in, but stayed outside. And the angel outside the tomb in Matthew says that Jesus is risen and is gone. So Mary encounters the one guy standing outside the tomb who's already seen what's inside and says, Jesus is risen and gone. Well, then Simon Peter enters or arrives, catches up to the other disciple, and enters the tomb alone in the Gospel of John. In Mark, which happens next, Mary comes during sunrise and goes into the tomb and sees one angel inside the tomb who says that Jesus is risen and is gone. Uh, the next up in Gospel of John, the other disciple later comes in and joins Simon Peter. And in Luke, which happens later, early in the morning, Mary comes and sees two angels inside who say that Jesus is risen and is gone. In John, Mary later returns to the tomb and sees the two angels inside. And in Luke, after Mary had gone and left, Simon Peter says two other men from their group had returned and went in after the women had left. So if you kind of line these up next to each other, you can see how like at first there was one man who got to the tomb, stayed outside, and in Matthew, which happens the first of the other three, they find one angel standing outside. Then Simon Peter arrives and enters the tomb alone. And then in Mark, which happens next, there's one angel inside the tomb. Then the other disciple joins Simon Peter inside, so there's two people inside the tomb. And then in Luke, which happens next, there's two angels inside the tomb. And then later, when Mary returns in the Gospel of John, that's also later in the Gospel of Luke when two other people have gone back. So if you line these up side by side, it looks like, everyone's assuming these people are angels when really it's just different groups of Jesus disciples showing up at different times. And whoever's inside, whoever's near the tomb or inside the tomb, because it's dark out, it's still really early in the morning. They're just mistaking each other for each other. And basically, the idea here is that because these all line up so well, basically it's supposed to be a comedy of errors where Mary found Lazarus's tomb and not Jesus' tomb because it was dark out. They're in the same area. She finds this empty tomb and just assumes that it's Jesus' tomb, goes off and tells everyone, and people just keep coming a few at a time. And each time they encounter the last person who says, Jesus is risen. And then, you know,
I,
basically each time they're finding somebody who's already been told the lie, who then repeats the lie to them, and then they can repeat the lie to other
it's
people.
literally like, yeah, showing how this game of telephone started. Like, it's like at first I was like kind of seeing all this and like kind of trying to say like what's the point, but then I saw, okay, yes, basically like they think the people are angels, and so it corresponds. But also, like, I just had this idea, like this whole thing playing out like almost like some kind of fucking acid trip or something, where they're all just like tripping balls and like they don't know like who's there. Like, Lazarus, he's dead, he's risen, you're an angel, like he came here, people are leaving, coming and going, and like like, I'm just thinking of like
Yep.
all Jesus and all his disciples are all just like fucking blitzed out their asses, like just making shit up as they go. Like, someone needs to do like a comedy sketch of it. Yeah, that's wild. Oh, and then the
Yeah,
Lazarus thing. I forgot all about like Lazarus risen from the dead. Like the fact that his tomb is like right there, also risen from the dead, is like, okay, that's convenient.
yeah. So you already have this empty tomb with, a body missing from it. And then they just happen to find an empty tomb with a body missing from it and assume that it's Jesus' tomb when it's really in the same place as Lazarus's tomb.
Yeah,
That also brings up the parallel between Lazarus or Elisar, one of the leaders of the Jewish rebellion, who was captured in the same place as Jesus. There's a parallel there too with their tombs being in the same place and the one being mistaken for the other,
yeah.
where he's almost telling you you're supposed to assume that these two characters are the same, so that way you'll realize that the Messiah in one story is a parody of the leader of the Jewish rebellion in the other story.
Well, this is okay. Okay, so this is like a whole new thing where we're talking about like the Gospels being a parody, the Gospels being a satire of the Wars of the Jews. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Uh, well, if they were both created by the same people, then like it's sort of like each of them has their like satirical elements in it that play off of each other.
Hmm.
But until you've read both of them and see how the pieces fit together, you're not necessarily going to realize that it's, a parody.
And so, and I guess this is like the idea that like Josephus wrote both for different audiences. Is that
Yeah.
that kind of the thing? Okay, okay.
Yeah, where Wars of the Jews was more written for like the Roman elites, whereas the Gospels were written for supposedly for the Jewish masses to give them a new religion, but really for the Roman masses to give them a new.
Wow. Wow, 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 wow.
Yep.
What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, the other thing too, like just the whole idea of like Jesus resurrecting as it's told in the Bible, and it's like, but he hardly does anything before he vanishes off. He went to heaven anyway. It's like, oh yeah, he came back. He's totally alive, but actually he went to heaven anyway. He just wanted to show up for a second and say peace, but only like two people saw him, and then he went back to heaven anyway. It's like it's such a fucking, it's so half-assed. Oh my god. Anyway, wild.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird story to begin with when you really think about it, but yeah. All
Like
right.
just as a sorry, one more side note. It's just like just once again how it's like it's so hard to believe that so many people believe this is real in in the modern age, like with so much information against it. I guess it just like speaks to a lot of things. I guess for one, just like the social programming, just like you just believe what you're handed down and you don't question it, and everyone else is pretending, so you pretend too, no matter how stupid it is. It's like, and then you have stuff like Scientology that comes up where it's just like it's like literally almost like absurd on purpose, and people, it's
Mhm.
just it's wild, 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 wild.
Yeah, Scientology got like once you actually get into like the backstory of how they believe that we were created and came to be
Yeah,
and all that, like it's such an absurd religion.
it's
And
literally
yet
by a
they're
science fiction writer. Like it's
yeah,
mind-boggling. I mean,
science
it's so
fiction writer who
sad.
said that the real money is in religion and that was why he created one.
Yeah, it's
Like,
wow.
yeah,
It's like it's sad, honestly. It just kind of
yeah,
like it just reinforces how stupid humans are and how like democracy is a failure. Yeah, I mean, yeah,
yeah.
that's probably the biggest conclusion. Like people should not have the level of power or any kind of influence. Like, jeez,
Yeah,
jeez,
well, and as far as Christianity's like popularity these days, it's almost getting a resurgence on the far right, not because of anything like inherent to Christianity
right?
itself
Just to
or
troll
the belief
liberals.
system. It- Partly that, and partly just like people want to cling to tradition, and they're like, our ancestors have been Christian for 1,000 years or
Yeah,
whatever. Might as well, be Christian too. And it's like, well, that's not really your people's traditional belief. That was the belief that was imposed on them in place of their traditional
yeah.
beliefs.
It's
Yeah.
like it's that's a whole other thing. I've written a decent and thought a decent bit about that, about this like new strain, because like yeah, like traditional Christianity seems to be kind of like petering out, but then like you've got this new wave of, like you said, like almost like alt righters and like trad people that are kind of just either doing it to just piss off liberals, or they're just, yeah, like you said, they're kind of grasping for some kind of tradition, but they're not going back far enough, and they just and like the hoops. And what's wild is like how many of them are aware of the Jewish question, but yet they jump through all of these hoops to try to say that like Christianity is not Jewish and Jesus is not Jewish and it's not all like it that's just like, because it's almost simpler to think about like dumb people just being dumb and just like going around with it, but this is like intelligent people trying so hard to like make this work so they have something to believe in. It's just it's a whole other
Yeah,
level.
they want to cling to the religion that they were raised with or to, the biggest religion in their country, and hope that they can turn that against the Jews. And it does like
To an
there
extent.
are definitely verses in the New Testament that you can look at and say, okay, this is anti-Jewish. There's a way that you can read it and be like, okay, this is critical of Jews. You can do the same thing with Karl Marx because he criticized the Jews and he called out the, Jewish central bankers and stuff in Europe. But at the same time, he was Jewish and created a Jewish control scheme that was spread almost entirely by Jews. And
Yeah, you
so
just
here you
choose your
have,
pick your poison.
yeah,
Choose
here you
choose
have,
among your Jewish
uh,
schemes.
yeah, here you have a Jewish religion that is totally anti-Jewish, bro, but yet all of its criticisms of Jews are still coming from a very Jewish place and telling you to worship a Jew. And, it was a religion that was spread almost entirely by Jews in the early days.
Yep.
So there's a lot of parallels there between, the creation and spread of communism and the creation and spread of
Oh
Christianity,
God, yeah.
which Marx even kind of like modeled some parts of communism off of Christianity because of how well it worked.
Yep.
And it's like, well, maybe you should take a lesson from that and look at your own religion and be like, okay, was this just 2,000-year-old communism, or because
Yep.
that is kind of what it looks like in a lot of
Oh yeah,
ways.
I've made that parallel a ton of times. Like basically just Christianity as cultural Marxism. Like absolutely everyone's equal. Like reject the world. Like mostly yeah just mostly the whole equality kind of thing. Like it's very communistic.
Yeah,
Subsidize the weak. You know, very anti-evolution, very anti-Darwinism, survival of the fittest kind of stuff, which is the natural
yeah.
way.
Give away everything you own, hate your own elites. Uh,
Hate turn your
yeah,
family over. Yeah, like yeah, yep.
yeah, divide your family against itself. Yeah,
Yeah. Like people. That's another thing too about the whole like because the whole pacifism of Christianity and a lot of these like alt writers are like trying to like make Christianity be this like crusades kind of thing. Like and they also try to like falsely equate a lot of like European greatness or attribute that to Christianity. Like they were in. I'm just like no, like there's obviously no verses to like to support like Jesus being like actually like violent. There's like he flipped over the tables and then he said I want to bring the sword. And if you read the verse after he brings the sword, he says I'm bringing the sword to turn family against themselves. Like that's the most communistic shit I've ever heard. And then
yeah.
like
I
yeah
think there's one point where he says like, "Sell your cloak and buy a sword," and then one of his disciples does that and strikes a Pharisee with the sword, and Jesus heals the Pharisee, and it's like, "No, I never told you to use the sword. I just told you to buy it." It's like, okay, bro,
oh
you don't
god.
want them to strike down the evil sinner with it? Okay,
Yeah, that's just wild,
yeah,
wild.
yeah. All right, so these last yeah, I guess we're on the next to last slide here, and this one is kind of tying it back to Titus's involvement in all of this, because of course Titus was the one who destroyed the Jewish temple, and there were a bunch of verses. We're gonna go ahead and read some of them, where basically Jesus predicted what most people consider to be the second coming, and said that with the second coming, Jerusalem would be surrounded and the temple destroyed, and all of this, and that the Son of Man would be the one to do all of this, and that's what he referred to the second coming as, more or less. Um, you got the slide pulled up?
Yep, got it.
Okay. All right. So I'll go ahead and just read the ones from Luke. So Luke 21, 5 through 6. And as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, "These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." Luke 21:20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. 21:27. And they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. 21:32. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all things take place. And 21:36. Watch therefore and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and stand before the Son of Man. So the generation living at the time that Jesus was supposedly speaking in the early 30s AD would by no means pass away before the coming of Jerusalem being surrounded by armies and the temple being torn down so not one stone would be left upon another. Uh, like he's basically saying by the time the people who were listening to him in the 30s AD were dead, that Jerusalem would be surrounded, defeated, and the temple would be destroyed. And of course, in 70 AD, Jerusalem was surrounded, defeated, and the temple destroyed, which would have been, roughly within the lifespan of many of the people that would have been alive in 30 something AD. But that destruction of the temple was carried out by Titus, who was the son of a man, Vespasian, but he was also the son of a god, Vespasian, because Vespasian was deified as the emperor. He also became a god himself when he became emperor and got deified. So you have a god man who is the son of a god man who destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and roughly the time period that Jesus said that the temple would be destroyed.
Yep.
So yeah, you think about that, and it's basically prophesying Titus coming and destroying the temple. But if that makes Titus the son of man, And that means that the Savior was not just a Jewish man, the Savior was also a Roman man who was also the Emperor of Rome. And so it really makes you wonder. And like there are Christians who will look at those verses and say, "Oh yeah, Jesus was, predicting the destruction of the temple, and it happened, and that's proof that Jesus was a prophet and he was real." And it's like, okay, well, if that's the case, then that would make Titus the second coming. So why does your gospel not, or why does your Bible not have the Gospels of Titus? Why does it not have the story of Titus and Vespasian? Why does it start with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel instead of Romulus and Remus? Like why is Roman history and Roman mythology not part of the Bible alongside the Jewish stuff if Titus was the Son of Man, if Titus was the second coming that, inherited the blessing and carried it on?
Wow.
Because, yeah, the way the Gospels are written, it's written as though Titus is basically the inheritor of, Jesus and his ministry, and that he was the next coming because he's the one that destroyed the temple, just like Jesus said would be done by the Son of Man.
Wow.
And there are Christians who will sit there and claim that Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, but then they don't connect the dots and say, well, that would make Titus the second coming of Jesus. None of them are worshiping Titus. None of them are, they might have a cross or a crucifix. None of them has a bust of Titus. None of them has any symbolism of Titus going on. You have to ask, if this is true, from the Christian perspective that Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, why is the guy who destroyed the temple, who would have been the Son of Man, not also deified in their religion, not also at least a prophet in their religion? Why is he not considered part of the religion? Why are they not learning more about him and that side of things? Um, and that's a big question that Christians haven't really ever been forced to tackle.
See, this is where some evidence for the idea that this is more of a Jewish created psyop rather than a Roman created psyop. Because if you feel like if it was a Roman created psyop, they Romans obviously were already like deifying themselves and seeing themselves that way. You would very much think that they would have just tried to get the religion to just like worship them or in some regard like they would. I just can't imagine that Romans would have had like the I don't know, just would have had the forethought or the idea to kind of create the religion as it kind of turned out. Then again, like Flavius Josephus, obviously being a Jew on the Roman side, yeah, that's definitely more conceivable. Either way, it's like definitely seems like a Jewish invention at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, and you can see how, from Josephus talking to Titus, he would have been like, well, we're tricking them into worshiping a Messiah who, parallels both Julius Caesar and, you and Vespasian. And, basically we're tricking them into worshiping the Roman Caesars and, paying their respects for the emperor.
Right.
And so in that sense, you can see where they would have looked at it and said, well, okay, at least, if you're tricking them into worshiping us, that's
Yeah.
and the religion is also pacifying them and telling them not to resist and to render under Caesar
Yeah.
what's Caesar's and all of that. Basically you can see how Titus and Vespasian would have looked at that and said, well, it's definitely better than what the Jews believe now. Okay, go ahead with it. But then somewhere, under the surface there, you kind of wonder, like, was Josephus writing this with the like intentional parallels between
Yeah.
Julius Caesar and Titus and Jesus, with the intent of these parallels are then going to grab onto the Roman mind
Yep.
and trick them into
Yep.
worshiping a Jew rather than grabbing the
Yep.
Jewish mind and tricking them
That's
into
not
worshiping a
that
Roman.
that definitely seems a lot more likely. Like that's like the 300 IQ move on his part, where he betrays the Jews to go help the Romans and convinces the Romans that he's gonna pacify the Jews, but like he creates this like big brain like basically flips the script and becomes like low key like the hero of the Jews subverting the Romans. Like that's fucking even if yeah, I subscribe to that. Honestly,
Yeah.
it's just too perfect. It's too fucking perfect.
Yeah, like when you look at the way that Jews operate today with their
Exactly.
60 chess moves and how they're
Yes.
like, they'll give you Trump and Clinton and they'll pit them against each other and they already know which one of
And
them is
they're
going to
always
win and
loyal to.
when.
And it's like we know that they backstab, but they're loyal to their own. So like that fits perfectly. Like that. That's
Uh-huh.
fits fucking perfectly. Oh my goodness.
Yep.
Yep. Ship it.
All right. Oh, yeah, I guess one more point before we get to the last slide is, with there being four different gospels, each of them seems kind of like it was written for a different audience. So I think it's Matthew. I forget if it was Matthew or Mark, but one of them is like written very much with the Jewish audience in mind. Tons of parallels with like the Old Testament in it, more so than the others. Luke is definitely written more with a Roman emphasis in mind, where that like it's much more pro-Roman in the way that it says things, and like there's no criticism whatsoever of the Romans in that one. It absolves them of any guilt of anything. John is written more with like aspects of like Platonism and like Greek philosophy kind of worked into it. So you can kind of see how like the reason why there were multiple gospels in the first place was so he could be like, well, I'm going to give this gospel to the Roman leaders to make them see, oh, I'm making a religion that looks good. But then we're going to give this other copy over here
Yeah.
to the Jews because some of them will actually believe that. And we're going to spread this one in Greece and this one.
That's like
So part of it,
once again like 400 IQ. Like whenever I'm talking about in the modern day, like how can we like create a religion and like how can we appeal to the different like audiences out there? Like it's the same kind of thing. Well,
mhm,
good stuff.
yep.
Good
All right, so
stuff.
let's go on to this last slide, which is about the Flavian family's ties to Christian history and how involved they were in the early Christian church. Uh, You've got Pope Clement the First, who was the Bishop of Rome late in the first century, supposedly ordained by Simon Peter, may have been the Clement mentioned by Paul in Philippians 4:3. There were early Christian texts that indicate that he was one of the first few bishops of Rome, but they kind of disagree on exactly like what the actual line of bishops was. But then like second through fourth century Christian texts uh, like name him and indicate that he was Titus Flavius Clemens, a cousin to Emperor Titus, who converted either to Judaism or Christianity, depending on which historians take on Titus Flavius Clemens you're reading. So if that was the case, and if Titus Flavius Clemens, the cousin of Titus of Emperor Titus, if he was actually the Pope Clement who became a bishop of Rome, uh, basically the leader of the Christian church, it would be weird, according to the perspective of Christians who think that Christianity was like super suppressed in ancient Rome and everyone was always shitting on the Christians for the first couple centuries. Well, if the Pope was a cousin to the emperor, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You know, um,
When was the timeline of that? When did Clement exist?
first century. So like we would have been talking like he would have been the Pope in probably the 80s or 90s.
I didn't. Wasn't like the whole papacy and all of that is under the Catholic umbrella, right? I didn't know that there was not a pope that long ago. That doesn't track because like I thought it was like
Well,
Christianity was like persecuted for the first couple hundred years. Then like around 300 or so, you get the Edict of Milan, and then you get what's his name Constantine. Actually, at that point, it basically spreads and becomes like then he converts.
yeah,
eh,
so Constantine is the one that made it the official like religion of Rome. But like at the time that this was happening, there were many different religions in Rome, and so it would have been like one of many religions, competing basically for the Roman populace at that time.
Like Christianity was
And there,
competing, right? But that's what I'm saying though. But Christianity was around then, but not the actual idea of the Pope or like the that whole thing wasn't there yet.
um, according to the Bible itself, like in Acts, Simon Peter was the first bishop of Rome, which basically is what became the Pope. And so basically, Simon Peter was the first leader of the Church of Rome, and then Clement would have been either his direct successor or one of the few successors after that.
Interesting.
So
I have to research
it
that
wouldn't
more.
have been like an official like state sanctioned position like the Pope became under Constantine,
Right.
but it was like the Bishop of Rome was basically the leader of the church for the first century, which when you think about, Bible history and how supposedly the disciples were all from Israel and Judea, it's a little bit weird that by the end of Acts, you've already got the leaders of the church all being in Rome rather than being in Israel and Judea. Like you would expect the leaders to still be in Israel and Judea where they came from, whereas in Acts they basically all moved to Rome, and the church leadership is all run out of Rome rather than being run out of Israel and Judea where it's from.
Okay. This is new to me. This is
Which
totally
that
new.
fact alone is a little bit weird.
Because it does say, yeah, so Clement of Rome, it says papacy began 92 AD, papacy ended 100 AD. Pope Bishop of Rome, first apostolic fathers of the church, living in the church in Rome. Yeah, that is very strange. Clement's life, and you're saying this guy was the cousin of the emperor at the time?
So it's kind of disputed by historians whether he was or not, but if you look at early Christian texts from like roughly between 100 and 300 AD, there were multiple Christian texts that indicated that Clement, the guy who was the Bishop of Rome and one of the early leaders of the church, was Titus Flavius Clemens, the cousin of Emperor Titus. So
Interesting.
not every historian agrees with that, but early Christian texts say that.
It does say it's likely that he died in exile, possibly martyred. Apocryphal, interesting. According to apocryphal stories dating back to the 4th century by authors such as Rufinus, imprisoned by Roman Emperor Trajan, lied and thrown into the sea. So I mean, it sounds like even though they were trying to establish some legitimacy and like papacy, like it was still being they were still persecuted in theory.
Yeah. Well, by the time that he got persecuted, I think the Flavian emperors were out of power and it was their competitors who were in power. It was either their competitors or it was like a later one of the Flavian emperors, like Domitian or somebody who did not agree with some of what Titus did.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Lots of weird Roman politics tied up in this that
Yeah.
I'm not like total expert on, unfortunately.
Yeah, but
Uh,
that definitely those were critical pieces at the time for how this played out for sure.
yep. And then you had Flavia Domitilla, who was the granddaughter of Vespasian, who was probably married to her cousin Titus Flavius Clemens, the guy who likely converted to Christianity and may have been the bishop of Rome. There's a place called the Domitilla Catacombs, which are named for her, and they are basically one of the oldest Christian burial sites, and they contain a mix of both Roman pagan and Jewish and Christian art. But they're named for her. They have inscriptions to her, and like it's pretty clear that she converted to Christianity. So you had at least at least that one member who basically all historians agree that she was related to Vespasian. She did convert to Christianity. She was like a big like early figure in the Christian church, canonized as a saint, donated land and such to the church. So you do at the very least have one member of the Flavian family who absolutely is confirmed. No serious historian is like disputing that she was both related to Titus and Vespasian and that she converted to Christianity and supported the early church. So you do have links between Titus and Vespasian and the early church through her that are completely confirmed.
Okay. Um,
And then, oh, go ahead.
this is kind of like I was kind of getting ahead of myself and thinking, and I'm just processing a lot. But one thing I just I went back to the just the idea that the Wars of the Jews is parody or not, or or if Christianity, the Gospels were based on it, or vice versa. And I was trying to
Mm.
think if surely the events that were chronicled in the Wars of the Jews have been verified by other sources, or like that, like it tracks, like the Roman conquest of Galilee would have made sense. Like there's other evidence of like that story. I'm assuming, like that backs up the idea that it wasn't satirical
Well, so
to
the
an
events
extent.
took place, but like, you can write a historical text that's, totally based on true events and still be putting your own spin on it, basically.
Exaggerated, yeah, yeah, and that's
Yeah.
the thing. Like, there definitely, I'm sure there are pieces of the conquest that would be verifiable, but those are like more high level things. Like a lot of those particular pieces that parallel the Gospels probably are less, obviously more specific and hard to verify by other sources. So it's still up in the
Yeah.
air,
So
basically.
what Yeah, so when you're looking at Wars of the Jews, like obviously the temple got destroyed. We have, physical evidence of that, plus tons of other people confirming that event happened. But as far as things like, the woman named Mary who ate half of her baby Jesus, or, the woe saying Jesus and things like that, specific events that were retold in the Wars of the Jews, some of those specific events may have been made up just for that text. Some of those specific events may have been, exaggerated or embellished or whatever. He may have just been kind of going off and writing his own things in certain areas, while other things were totally based on fact.
Okay, I had to ask one more question, and not to derail too much, and we'll go where we need to go with it. But I'm trying to think. So just back to this idea that Wars of the Jews was like the possibility it was satirical, and then the
Mhm.
Gospels obviously like the maybe the Gospels weren't written down, but let's say the Gospels did come first. So if Josephus was not the creator of the Gospels, if he was parodying them, then we have to what who like what's the theory for what are there any alternative theories then for who then were I guess I guess the idea is just that like the events themselves happened, people were just sharing stories about it, and that's where Josephus came across it. Well,
Yeah,
or it could have been someone else was actually creating like there's two possibilities, like at least two possibilities. One, the stories actually happen pretty close to how they are talked about in the Gospels, and people just told stories about them until Josephus basically made a satire of the stories he heard, or someone else may have created. Oh, I don't know. There's so many possibilities. Josephus himself could have written the Gospels and the satire.
yeah.
Someone else could have written the Gospels first with different intents, and then he could have. There's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, there's plenty of possibilities. Some people think that Saul of Tarsus, who changed his name to infiltrate Rome, basically, that he was the creator of Christianity. Other people think that that like he may have been a real historical figure, but his writings were changed over time or whatever. And there's dispute over like which of the letters that are attributed to him are even his and all that. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of questions, but I definitely think that the idea that Josephus made up Wars of the Jews and then the Gospels, either he made them up, to like kind of parallel each other, or that someone working with him made them, helped him make them up. One of the ideas that Joseph Atwill actually puts forward is that John, one of the rebel leaders that we talked about, who was imprisoned by the Romans but allowed to live, and basically was turned into like a scholar or a scribe, just like Josephus was. That he may have been the one that wrote the Gospels, or at least helped write the Gospels, while Josephus was writing Wars of the Jews, and the two of them were like working together and coordinating.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so there's two possibilities there. But personally, I think the most likely one is that Christianity was created either at the same time or after the writing of Wars of the Jews, and that there was like intent in the writing of both the Gospels and in the writing of Wars of the Jews to have them parallel each other and to create Christianity as a religious control.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm thinking too. Like just like almost more. Again, I'm getting a little bit of ahead because we still have another slide, but just like
Yeah.
sort of like closing thoughts is like, at the end of the day, it's almost just kind of like fun to speculate, and there's a lot of possibility. But there's at least two main takeaways that we can focus on regardless. Like a, just how Christianity functions and the fact that it does have a lot of mechanisms and traits of a control scheme, and B, how the Jews operate. Like those are just always the themes you can come back to regardless of what actually ended up happening. So
Yeah, and the more you understand about how the Jews operate, the less you like can trust anything that they've put their hands on.
yep, 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 yep,
Yeah.
yep.
But yeah, I guess this last part of this slide, Emperor Constantine, also known as Flavius Valerius Constantinus, was the emperor who made Christianity the official religion of Rome. Constantine's line are referred to as the Neo-Flavians, but their relation to the original Flavian dynasty is disputed, even though they had the same name. But whether he really was descended from, Titus and Vespasian, or whether he just stole their name, uh, one way or another, he was responsible for the Council of Nicaea, which solidified church doctrine. He moved the capital of Rome to Constantinople. But yeah, he was largely responsible for Christianity becoming like the state religion of Rome in many occasions, to kind of forcibly convert them to Christianity, whether they liked it or not. He also had quite a few Jews that were close to him, and gave Jews some special privileges that he didn't give to Christians. Same with like some of the bigger names in terms of spreading Christianity. So you had like Charlemagne, who did a lot to spread Christianity, invited thousands of pagans to a peace treaty signing, basically, and then killed the thousands of pagans that showed up to make peace. And then once a bunch of pagan men were dead, from that, he invaded their lands, and it was easier to take them over because a bunch of their leaders had just been killed. And Charlemagne, for all that he murdered his fellow Europeans and tried to drive out paganism, he did not have the same animosity towards Judaism that he had towards paganism. And in fact, he gave the Jewish bankers the special privileges to control the banks and loan money at interest that he did not give to Christians. And that was one of the things that helped Jews take over the banks of all of Europe, was that Charlemagne created those separate rules that let Jews loan at interest and Christians not let loan at interest. That made Jews the basically the number one bankers in Europe because they were the only ones making any money off of it.
God,
Uh,
it just all fits so perfectly, and but it's like
yeah.
what I'm also thinking too is like, not only is the time between like the life and the works of Jesus and the actual like a known like establishment of Christianity and right of Christianity, that period is very foggy, but
Mhm.
so is the period of like there to like Christianity's rise from being like persecuted, underground, whatever, to becoming the official religion of Rome is also like really just like weird and sudden and not well documented. Like it's just it stinks of it's it's got that Jewish stench to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and there were plenty of, libraries that got burned. There were plenty of, pagan temples that had their own collections of writings that got burned.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, and some of that, I think the Library of Alexandria burning was older than that. But
Yeah, I did write that down
some
in
of
my
that was stuff
notes.
that,
I had to
yeah.
look up what the timeline. Apparently, it had burned multiple times, like around that time,
Oh,
like
okay.
like
Yeah.
in the late BC and early AD, like it burned multiple times, as well as, yeah, there was just
Mm,
probably tons of like book burnings and people burnings throughout history from Christians and others.
yeah.
So it's just kind of like it's just sad that, like, I mean, we and luckily we still have stuff that slipped through the cracks, like the other books we know about and so forth. But yeah, I mean, there's probably like plenty of damning evidence out there that was lost, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, and even when you look at like early Christianity, there were multiple different sects of Christianity that were all kind of competing for each other.
Right.
And so it kind of makes me wonder if like were there some of them that maybe were relatively more legitimate, but then the one that survived was the one that was created as an artificial control scheme. It's possible that there was some other, real Christian religion that Josephus was hired to like make a fake version of it and spread that to like compete with the real one or something like that.
Oh my goodness, yeah, so many
Who
possibilities.
knows?
Well, that's
Yeah,
like
so
if you
so
when you
many
talk to
possibilities, but
when you talk to
yeah,
a lot of Christians, you hear this like that's not real. Like whenever you start to describe Christianity as like this pacifying force of like control, and you use justification for that by like how people act in the modern day and what it actually does to people, and they're like, well, those aren't real Christians, and the real Christianity just says to do this, and obviously that's like the real Christianity that there's evidence of. Like there's probably like strands of it that, like you said, were probably just stamped out altogether. So yeah, it's just a mess.
yeah,
Just
yeah.
a
Which it would be
mess.
kind of like cool and interesting to see somebody like try to resurrect one of the alternative branches of Christianity that was around back then. But I think the only one that's really survived in any real form is like Gnostic Christianity, and even that, like
Yeah.
a lot of what the Gnostic Christians believed, 17, 1800 years ago has probably been lost.
Yeah, like
But at least what we have of theirs is quite a bit more interesting than like the actual mainstream Christianity
yeah,
that
I
we
do
have.
I do agree. Like that kind of stuff, which I know that's what. So I think the Gospel of Thomas gets more into a lot of the Gnostic kind of stuff, where and then the Enoch gets into like the crazy Anunnaki kind of stuff. But yeah, there's been times
Yeah,
where I've like kind of thought about like, do I want to work with this? But more times than not, I'm just like, I just don't want to think about Christianity at all. Like I don't even I typically don't even want to get it sucked into these kind of conversations. Like this conversation we're having is more of a historical conversation. What I don't want to do is get sucked into like what do you like almost like theological conversations or like biblical, like really like, well, what did the Bible say, and what, I just
yeah,
don't care. Like but I do kind of hope that there are some people out there that feel like tasked with trying to do something with Christianity. because obviously it's not just going to vanish overnight. Like more often than not, it's just going to kind of change form and adapt.
Yeah.
So I just
Well,
have
and you did see like Hitler made an attempt to sort of change Christianity with he called it positive Christianity, and basically he threw out like 90% of the Bible and like
exactly.
rewrote rewrote the Gospels so that Jesus was no longer a Jewish man and was instead like a non-Jew rebelling against Jewish control and
That's kind of base as
like
fuck. I never heard of that, but
yeah.
I do remember asking ChatGPT not too long ago, like what were Hitler's thoughts on Christianity, and I was like fucking like exactly what I think about it, which is exactly what anybody who is like aware of like evolution and reality would think about it. That it is pacifying, that it is Jewish, that it is enslaving, like that it does all this kind of, that it's very communistic, like yeah, like that's obviously what it did, like
Mm.
and I'm it's just kind of almost gratifying anytime you come across someone else who has seen these same things, and let alone H-Man himself. But anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately his version of Christianity did not catch on and was pretty much suppressed and destroyed at the end of the war too.
mm,
So,
yep, I didn't know about that. That's pretty funny though.
yeah. Yeah, that's I think that was the last of the slides, so that's about it for what I've got. Yeah, so I mean, just to wrap up, we've seen how there's tons of weird parallels between Wars of the Jews and the Gospels that are most easily explained by assuming that they were created together. Any alternate explanation that requires a lot of thought being put into it. But even though that's the case, I'm not going to share Joseph Atwell's like atheistic interpretation that this was all just an artificial social construct to control people. I think there was a spiritual side to it as well. And the main reason that I think that is, I'm someone who's come around to the idea that spiritual manifestation works, that basically everybody has some amount of like spiritual energy that they can channel. And if you focus that consistently on wanting some particular thing, you're not necessarily going to like change the whole world around you to make it happen, but you can pull things into your life. So, for example, about a year and a half ago, I ended up quitting a job. I spent quite a bit of time meditating on the need for a new job, and not only did I get one that met the requirements that I need, but there was weird spiritual symbolism in the name of the company that I got a job with.
Hell yeah.
Um, there's tons of examples of people doing that kind of spiritual manifestation. And so when you think about it, as you're even if you haven't done like the kind of like energy work and meditation and spiritual practice that I've done to learn how to like actually harness that energy and use it, everyone still has a little bit and everyone can still focus it a little bit. So if you get a bunch of people together, you have them all kind of like focusing their spiritual energy the same way, that can be more powerful than just one person doing it on their own. If you get them all spiritually manifesting their energy towards saying, "We praise the King of the Jews, we love the King of the Jews, hail the King of the Jews," what happens when billions of people are all praising the King of the Jews? Well, if you're all focusing that spiritual energy on worship of the King of the Jews, how much does that empower Jews to rule over you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And like even on a more tangible scale, it's just like the idea that like if you get enough people to believe something, it almost like becomes true. Like no matter how absurd or how little evidence there is or how self-contradictory is all things which Christianity is, it just goes to show if you can just kind of play the game right and get the right momentum and get enough people believing it, it almost becomes true. And obviously they use these kind of circular logic where it's like, well, it's true because like it's true because someone went back in time and wrote this thing, like someone went back in time and wrote a prophecy in hindsight that obviously became true because they know. And they're it's
Yeah,
just
it's about the same thing as, The Simpsons predicting events that are being scripted and acted out by the same group of people that told The Simpsons what events to put in their show.
yep. Yeah, it's like wow, they're prophecy, they're geniuses. Yeah, I think
Yep.
that's like my once again my like probably like three just general takeaways that kind of supersede any speculation is just again like Jews, what they do, uh,
60 chess.
Christianity, what it does, pacifies people, stupid people, fucking stupid people are always just gonna be stupid, weak.
Always a problem.
And I guess number four too, you just think about just like the Roman Empire and just power and politics and just how that whole thing goes. Like we know about, and you just you put those pieces together, and you kind of you get what you get, and
Yep.
so our path forward looks similar regardless, but it's definitely very interesting to break it down. This is deeper than I've ever really gone, uh, but it tracks. It definitely tracks with what we know.
Yep. Yeah. All
Cool
right. Well,
deal.
that's
Yeah.
that's pretty much all I had on that topic. But I think probably my next really big episode with you, and it's going to take some time to put this together, but I do want to talk about like occult spirituality, some of what the elites believe, and by the elites I mean like the Kabbalists and Freemasons and other like secret society type groups that are sort of doing occult spirituality and using it as a tool and controlling major institutions by doing so.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of going to track from this as like historical exploration of how one of the biggest social control schemes on earth was created. Well, now we're going to bring it back to the modern era and look at the people who created Back to the Future and some of the other movies and games and stuff that we've seen with predictive programming and stuff, and like what the people like the puppet string pullers at the top, like behind all of that, what do they believe and what do they practice and how does their belief and practice affect the way that they control the world, and which parts of their beliefs are things that and practices are things that we can adopt that will help us, and which parts are things that we should not adopt because it's theirs and we would be helping them, and
Mm-hmm.
what things do we need to do to replace those pieces to build our own spirituality that will empower us to resist them rather than being controlled by them. um, but understanding that our world is controlled by these secretive control schemes that are created by people who understand reality in a different way than most of the masses do, that's a big part of getting to where you need to be in order to put up a real resistance against.
Hell
So
yeah.
I think this is an important thing for people to understand, and hopefully we can reach some people with this, because people need to know how the biggest control schemes were created. People need to know that Jewish power didn't start with the banks. Jewish power didn't start with the ballot box. Jewish power started with religion and
Yeah.
with them convincing people to follow their social control schemes. And yeah, there was, political and economic scheming going on along the way the whole time as well. But it was really through religion that they managed to make their hold last and make it stick and really take control of Europe and then the Middle East, and spread from there.
And that's what I'm thinking too. Like that's really the key in our path forward. Like you said, we can take a lot from them and learn from them. And I'm just imagining like this. This is very this is the white pill to counteract the black pill of the situation we're in, which is that we just like I'm so ready for this kind of stuff to be more than just like even in my life it was like this was like I said when I first came across all this stuff it was like there's just absolutely no one I could even talk to this about, and now this kind of stuff is becoming like well known, and I'm just like really looking forward to it kind of really starting to manifest and not just be things that people are sharing with each other, but they're like established common beliefs, and now you start to get like some institutional momentum behind them, and you've got things like the Overton is always moving. You've got people like Elon Musk and like Joe Rogan and RFK and all these people that are like literally part like tied to the presidential administration now. So there's like a lot of good stuff happening. I feel like, and so I'm really happy to be a part of that, like that window moving, and just like looking forward to where we go from here. Hopefully,
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting opportunity, but at the same time, I kind of have my reservations about Trump and the people that are tied to him. And like, I don't see them as being true saviors who are actually going to save us,
oh
but
no,
as
no,
false saviors who
it's
are probably there to
yeah, no, it's definitely
pacify
very
people from
incremental
waking up.
victories. Like we still have to kind of accept that like anybody that's going to be anywhere near that level of power is still going to be like Israel's number one fan and stuff. Like
Oh
we're just
yeah.
going to have to kind of deal with that in the meantime. But as long as there's enough pieces to kind of keep things going and stuff, then we can work with it. So
Yeah. Well, and hopefully we can pick out some of the like right wingers who are not trustful of Trump and kind of get them on board with going down their own spiritual rabbit holes that they need to go down to get to the point where they understand the Jews and they understand what they're doing, And in the midst of all that black pilling knowledge about Jewish power, in the midst of
Mm-hmm.
thinking it's so over because they control everything, we're gonna find that white pill and find our we're so back moment.
Fuck yeah, dude.
And
It's so
pull it
funny.
the fuck out of our asses.
It's so funny too because we're like we're kind of almost like fighting for Trump as like a lesser of evils just to kind of like get an incremental victory, and like as soon as we win there we're kind of like immediately like, okay, fuck Trump, like we got to keep moving. Like this is like this funny thing.
Yeah, definitely.
This is like a funny thing that I've always thought about myself. I was like if I was somehow like teleported to like a reality where like half the things that I like advocate for are like now mainstream, like would I just like be a normie? Would I be happy and just like cool, or would I like still be the kind of dissident that I am, just then pushing for whatever the next thing is, like just always pushing forward, you know?
I'm the
Um,
new horizon and chase it.
yeah, I know. Like maybe my disposition is just always to be that kind of person versus like trying to reach any objective like destination. But at the same time, I don't. I do think that if I were in a reality that aligned with a lot of my beliefs, I would not have to like really be dissonant or fight. I would be like, okay, this is cool. Like we've got the things that I'm here for. It was not having these things that pushed me in this direction to start with. We'd be good. So anyway, that's the goal.
Yeah, that's interesting to consider because definitely one of the things that drives people like us to be so dissident is that our society is so unhealthy, like not just physically, but mentally and spiritually, politically, economically.
Yeah, yeah.
And that definitely drives us to those dissident movements.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
just like interesting to think about like what would a society need to look like in order for me to be a normie, in order for me to just be totally just normie, basically, Uh,
yeah,
that's the society to work towards, I suppose.
yeah. I don't think I'd ever be totally normal, but I think there are definitely like possible societies where I'd be a lot more like well adjusted to it and working with it instead of against it.
Yeah, yeah. We
But
really have no choice
don't
with
have
the
one of
one.
those,
Yeah,
so we gotta build it.
yeah, exactly. We have no choice with the one we're in, and we have to fucking repel this or become a fucking bug person.
Yep.
Cool, man. Alrighty, well, this has been a banger. It's our first kind of multi-video session. I hope everyone enjoys it. Definitely we'll be sharing this around, and I'm sure referring back to it in the future and making more content. So thanks everybody for watching, and we'll catch y'all next time.
All right.
Stopping it there.